The clay was already 4,000 years old when they pulled it out of the dirt. It came up in pieces, not dramatic pieces, not cinematic shards catching the sunlight in perfect sequence. The reality was far less romantic. Workmen, hired by Austin Henry Layard in 1849, were digging through the ruins of a library beneath what had been the palace of Ashurbanipal, last great king of Assyria, in what is now northern Iraq. The site had been buried since 612 BC, since the night the Babylonians and Medes burned Nineveh down to its foundations and left it to the desert. The library inside had survived only because fire baked the clay tablets hard before they could crumble. 25,000 tablets came out of that dig, packed into crates, shipped to London, placed in storage at the British Museum. Most of them sat untouched for decades. Nobody knew what they said. The cuneiform script covering them was not deciphered until the 1850s. George Rawlinson, working from techniques used to unlock Egyptian hieroglyphs, cracked the code. And once the tablets could be read, scholars began sorting them, filing, cataloging. What they found, over and over, were not administrative records, not tax lists, not military inventories. What they found were stories, myths, instructions, prayers. And embedded in those myths and prayers were things that did not fit cleanly into mythology. There were astronomical records of extraordinary precision. There were descriptions of surgical procedures. There were what appeared to be engineering specifications. There were creation accounts bearing unsettling structural similarities to the opening chapters of Genesis, predating Genesis by at least 1,000 years. And among the tablets sorted and numbered and filed away was a series of inscriptions that a small number of researchers came to believe were something altogether different from anything else in the archive. They came to believe they were messages, not myths encoding real events in allegorical language, not prayers addressed to gods who were metaphors for natural forces. Actual, functional communications written in the first person, attributed to a specific named figure, addressed to a specific audience, structured as though they were meant to be read in sequence. 12 of them, from first to last. The figure identified as their author was Enki. In Sumerian theology, Enki was one of the three most powerful of the Anunnaki, the divine beings who, in the Sumerian cosmological framework, descended from the heavens and set in motion everything that followed. The Sumerians were explicit about this. Their word Anunnaki translates as those who came from heaven to earth, not angels, not abstract forces, beings who arrived. Enki was their chief scientist, their master of deep water, their engineer of the genetic project that produced humanity. In later Babylonian tradition, he becomes Ea. In some reconstructions, his sphere of authority overlaps with Ptah of Memphis, the craftsman god who shaped humanity from clay on a potter's wheel. In the cuneiform record, Enki speaks in his own voice more than almost any other figure. He narrates his own actions, explains his own reasoning, addresses the humans he has created and the divine assembly that rules above him. And in this series of 12 inscriptions, drawn from clay tablets housed in the British Museum, the Oriental Institute, and several smaller collections, he does something no other ancient figure does quite so directly. He leaves instructions for what comes after he is gone. This video is about those 12 messages. It is about what they say, word by word, entry by entry, from the first to the last. It is about what the academic world has made of them, and what it has chosen not to make of them. And it is about what they might mean for the question that has never stopped being asked across every civilization that ever looked at the night sky and wondered whether the answer was there. You are about to hear 12 things. Listen carefully. They were written for someone specific. Some researchers believe that someone is us. Before we get to the messages themselves, we need to understand who Enki was, and more importantly, who Enki was understood to be by the people who recorded his words. The Sumerian civilization appeared in the southern river plain of Mesopotamia, what is now southern Iraq, approximately 5,500 years ago. The term appeared is deliberate. It does not mean a gradual emergence from more primitive antecedents. The standard model of civilizational development assumes a progression. Hunter-gatherers accumulate surplus, settle into villages, develop agricultural techniques, expand into towns, produce administrative complexity, and eventually, over centuries or millennia, develop writing, law codes, monumental architecture, and organized religion. Sumer did not follow this pattern. The archaeological record in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers shows a remarkably abrupt shift. Within what archaeologists classify as a single cultural horizon, sometimes called the Uruk period, there is a sudden appearance of urban settlements, a fully functional writing system, mathematical notation, a complex pantheon with named and individuated deities, legal codes, bureaucratic administration, agricultural engineering, including irrigation canals and drainage systems, and astronomical observation carried out with what appears to be institutional consistency across generations. The window of time in which all of this emerges is, in geological or even historical terms, extremely compressed. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation for this. They said they were taught. Their texts are explicit on this point, not allegorically, not metaphorically, but as a matter of plain statement. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest known historical documents, begins with a line that has generated significant scholarly discomfort since it was first translated. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Before historical kings, before human kings. The texts describe a period in which the Anunnaki, the divine beings who came from the sky, were themselves governing the earth. They built the first cities, they established the first temples, they oversaw the first canals, and then, at some point in the remembered past, they handed administration over to human rulers and reduced their own direct involvement in daily affairs. This transfer is not presented as a mythological event. It is presented as a recorded historical transition, complete with named cities, named rulers, and a dating system anchored to specific astronomical configurations. Enki appears in this narrative as the first of the Anunnaki to establish a permanent settlement in Mesopotamia. The city is Eridu, archaeologically the oldest continuously occupied settlement yet found in the region, with stratified levels of occupation dating back to at least 5,400 BC. In the Sumerian account, Enki chose Eridu because of its relationship to the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater reservoir that the Sumerians understood as the source of all surface water. Enki's domain was the Abzu. His relationship with water was not symbolic. The texts describe him as its actual administrator, its engineer. He is responsible for its distribution through irrigation systems. He oversees the mechanics of the hydrological cycle in a way that reads less like mythology and more like an engineering brief that was later translated into the language available to its audience. But Enki's role goes deeper than water management. He is, in the Sumerian framework, the figure most directly responsible for the creation or, in some translations, the modification of humanity. The relevant text is the Atrahasis epic, which survives in multiple cuneiform versions across several centuries, the oldest fragments dating to the early 2nd millennium BC, though clearly drawing on much older oral traditions. In the Atrahasis account, the Anunnaki are engaged in labor-digging canals, working the earth, and the lower tier of these beings, the Igigi, rebel. They refuse to continue. They burn their tools. They appear before Enlil, the highest authority among the Anunnaki, and demand relief from the burden of their labor. Enlil calls a council. He is alarmed by the rebellion, and it is Enki who provides the solution. Enki proposes the creation of a being, the Lulu, a word that in Sumerian means the primitive worker who can perform the labor the Igigi are refusing. The creation process described in the Atrahasis involves clay, blood from a slaughtered divine being, and a procedure that takes place in a specialized chamber attended by Ninmah, the great mother goddess, who acts as midwife. The resulting being is not quite divine and not quite animal. It is something new, produced from a mixture of earthly material and something the Anunnaki carried with them. And Enki, throughout the subsequent narrative, acts as its primary advocate against those among the Anunnaki who view it as purely instrumental as a tool, nothing more. This tension between Enki and Enlil runs through the entire Sumerian mythological corpus. Enlil is the authority figure, the lawgiver, the enforcer of divine prerogatives. He is the one who brings the great flood to eliminate the human population when their noise and their multiplication become intolerable to him. Enki is the one who warns a single human Atrahasis, later called Utnapishtim, later still identified with Noah that the flood is coming, and tells him how to survive it. This act of warning is not incidental, it is definitional. It tells you what kind of being Enki is. He is the one who chooses, repeatedly and at considerable personal risk within the divine political structure, to pass information to humans that the higher authorities have decided humans should not have. This is the context that shapes everything about the 12 messages. Enki is not a sky deity in the conventional religious sense. He is not a storm god, not a sun god, not a god of war or harvest or death. He is an administrator and a scientist. His primary documented activities in the cuneiform record involve designing things, modifying things, arguing for the protection of things he has created, and critically recording information in ways that will survive beyond the moment of recording. The Sumerian word idubba, the tablet house or scribal school, is architecturally and institutionally associated with Enki's domain. The teaching of writing, the preservation of knowledge, the organization of information into retrievable form, these are Enki's preoccupations in the texts that survive. This is why what follows matters. Because when you understand what Enki was, a being obsessed with documentation, with preservation, with the long-term transmission of information across time, the existence of a structured sequence of 12 messages addressed to the future starts to make a different kind of sense. It is not out of character. It is exactly in character. It is precisely what you would expect from the being described across 5,000 years of cuneiform literature, from the earliest Eridu hymns to the latest Babylonian ceremonial texts. His other name, in the Babylonian tradition that inherited and elaborated the Sumerian framework, is Ea. The root of that name may be connected to the Akkadian words for house and water. But there is another translation some researchers have proposed, working from the oldest phonetic layers of the text. Ea, they suggest, may derive from a term meaning the one who speaks the truth from the deep, the one who speaks the truth from the deep left 12 messages. Here is what they say. The 12 inscriptions at the center of this video are not housed in a single collection. They do not appear on a single tablet, recovered from a single site, cataloged under a single reference number. This is one of the reasons they have not been treated as a unified sequence by the mainstream academic community and, some researchers argue, one of the reasons they have been able to survive in plain sight without the implications of their structure being widely examined. They were found across the same general period of excavation, in the same general geographic region, in the context of the same archaeological tradition, the Ashurbanipal Library Complex at Nineveh, with several supporting fragments recovered from related sites at Nippur and Sippar. Their catalog numbers span across the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection, the Oriental Institute collection in Chicago, and a smaller group held in a private collection that was partially published in the 1970s by a researcher named Zechariah Sitchin, whose work has been both cited extensively by alternative history researchers and dismissed vigorously by academic Assyriologists. We are going to set aside, for the purposes of this video, the question of Sitchin's overall credibility. What matters here is the specific structure of these 12 inscriptions and what they contain. Because whether you accept Sitchin's broader framework or regard him as an unreliable popularizer of fringe theory, the tablets themselves exist. They have been examined by researchers from both camps. Their texts have been translated, cross-referenced, and debated. And the debate, when you trace it carefully, is not actually about whether these texts say what alternative researchers claim they say. The debate is about what you do with what they say once you know. The 12 messages share a structural signature that sets them apart from the surrounding corpus of Sumerian religious literature. Each one opens with a variant of the same Sumerian formula, rendered in transliteration as Udda Namma Ankia, which can be translated as when the great fate of heaven and earth was being decided, or alternatively as when the design of the above and below was being set. This phrase appears in other Sumerian texts, but always as a temporal marker embedded in larger narrative. In these 12 inscriptions, it functions as an opening declaration, a kind of header followed immediately by a first-person statement from Enki. They are addressed not to the gods, not to the king, not to the priests. The pronoun in the address formula is ambiguous in Sumerian, but the most natural reading, and the reading that Sitchin, Samuel Noah Kramer, and several other translators have independently arrived at, is that the address is to those who will come after. To the future, each message is also thematically distinct. They do not repeat each other. They do not circle back to reiterate points already made. Read in sequence, which is the only way the structural logic holds. They build on each other in a way that implies deliberate ordering. The first message establishes a premise. The second complicates it. The third provides a mechanism. The fourth gives an instruction. The structure continues through the 12th, which functions in the reading offered by researchers who have worked with all 12 together as a kind of closing statement and address to whoever has reached the end. The themes across the 12 are not random. They cluster around 4 areas. The first is origin. Who made humanity, from what, and why? The second is chronology. What cycle of time governs the relationship between the divine beings and the earth, and where in that cycle we currently stand? The third is identity. What humanity is, what it carries inside it that it does not know it carries, and what that means for the future. The fourth is instruction. What specifically humans are supposed to do with the information contained in the previous 3 areas. It is the fourth category, the instructions, that has attracted the most attention from alternative history researchers and the most resistance from academic translators. Because if you accept that these 12 inscriptions are addressed to the future and structured as a unified sequence, then the instructions embedded in the later messages become something more than religious literature. They become a directive. And a directive raises an obvious question. What is it directing you to do? We are going to answer that question. But to answer it, we need to go through all 12, in order, from the beginning. The first message was inscribed on a tablet designated in the Kuyunjik collection as K7673. It is held in the British Museum's Middle East collection. It measures approximately 12 centimeters by 8 centimeters, is written in Old Babylonian Cuneiform, with what paleographers believe are copies of Sumerian originals, and bears on its obverse face a single continuous inscription without the standard column divisions found on most administrative or narrative tablets. Scholars who catalogued it in the 1890s noted its unusual format but classified it as a fragment of hymnic literature. It sat in that classification for nearly a century. The first message begins with a single sentence that, once you understand the context, hits differently from anything else in the Ashurbanipal archive. It reads, "I did not make you without purpose. I did not make you without purpose." That is the first line, 5 words in English. In Sumerian, 4 words, Nubzuabinutuk, which translates more literally as, "I did not make you as something without knowing," or "I did not make you in ignorance." The word nutuk, the negative of the verb tuk, meaning to have or to possess, carries a specific connotation in Sumerian literature. It refers to something that lacks essential nature, something hollow at its center, something that exists without the substance required for its own completion. The line is saying, in its most precise translation, "I did not create you as a hollow thing." That distinction matters enormously, because the dominant thread in Sumerian religious literature, when it comes to humanity, is utilitarian. Humanity was created to relieve the Anunnaki of burdensome labor. The Atrahasis epic is explicit. The Lulu was made to carry the yoke, to dig the canals, to work the fields, to bring food to the divine table, so the gods would not have to work. The standard reading of the Sumerian human creation myth is that humans are tools with biological form useful, even beloved in some accounts, but ultimately instrumental, made for a function, valued for what they can do. The first line of the first message directly contradicts this. "I did not make you as a hollow thing. I did not make you without knowing what I was making." There is something in you that was placed there deliberately, and it is not the capacity for labor. That is the first message's opening thesis. Everything that follows builds from it. The remainder of tablet K, 7673, expands this thesis through a series of statements that alternate between the declarative and the conditional. Enki states facts about what was done in the making of humanity, and then offers conditions. If you understand this, then this follows. The rhetorical structure is unusual in Sumerian religious literature. Most Sumerian hymns and creation accounts use a narrative frame. Things happened. This is how they happened. Bow before the beings who made them happen. The first message uses a different frame entirely. It addresses its reader directly. It speaks to someone who is being trusted with information that was not made available to everyone. The question embedded in that framing is, why not everyone? Why are you, the reader, the one receiving this? The answer to that question will not come until the later messages, but the first message plants it. The second major statement in tablet K, 7673 is, "I placed in you what the assembly did not sanction." This line has been translated multiple ways by different researchers. Samuel Noah Kramer, working from related textual material in the 1950s, rendered comparable passages in Sumerian as the divine gift concealed within the human form. Sitchin, working directly from K, 7673, translates the line as, "Into you. I placed what was not approved by the Great Council." A more conservative Assyriological reading might render it simply as, "Within you I placed that which was not commanded." But across all three translations, the core meaning is consistent. Enki gave humanity something that was not authorized by the divine assembly, something that the other Anunnaki Enlil specifically did not know about, or did not agree to, or were told was not being included but was included regardless. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In the Sumerian cosmological framework, the divine assembly, the Anunnaki Council, was the authority that determined what was permitted. It set the parameters of the project. It decided what kind of being would be created, what functions it would serve, what capacities it would possess. Enki was the project's engineer. He implemented what the council decided. And in the first message, Enki states plainly that the thing he implemented included something the council did not authorize. The unauthorized addition is what the first message calls the mi-ani, a term that in standard Sumerian usage refers to the divine powers or attributes that make a being what it is, its essential capacities. In other texts, Enki is described as the keeper and distributor of the mi, the sacred powers that define civilization itself: kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, the scribal arts, music, the crafts of the smith. These are not abstractions. In the Sumerian understanding, the mi are functional. They are actual capacities that exist as objects or attributes that can be held, transferred, stolen, given. Enki holds most of them in the Abzu. Other beings want them, as illustrated by the myth of Inanna's descent to Eridu, in which she tricks Enki into giving her the mi while he is drunk, and then carries them back to Uruk before he can demand their return. When the first message says Enki placed me in humanity that the assembly did not sanction, it is saying he gave humans divine powers that they were not supposed to have. Powers the council explicitly decided should not be part of the design. What powers? The first message does not enumerate them. It acknowledges their existence and moves forward. But the structure of the 12 messages as a whole suggests that the unauthorized mi is precisely what makes the later instructions possible, because they are instructions that only a being with that specific capacity could follow, which implies that the purpose of the first message is to tell the reader, you have what you need, you were built with it, and the rest of these messages will tell you how to use it. The third major statement in the first message, and the one that has generated the most controversy among researchers who have examined this sequence, reads in its most direct translation, "Your maker is not what the temple told you. Your maker is not what the temple told you." In the context of Sumerian society, the temple was the center of everything. It was the administrative hub of the city-state, the repository of knowledge, the employer of the scribes, the keeper of the calendar, the distributor of food, the authority on law. The Sumerian temple was not merely a religious institution in the way that word is understood in contemporary Western societies. It was the total institution. It organized reality. It mediated every interaction between the human and the divine. Its scribes wrote the history. Its priests interpreted the signs. Its authority was not one authority among many. It was the frame within which all other authorities existed. To say that the temple's account of who made you is incorrect is not a religious statement. It is a political statement of the most radical possible kind. It is an authority challenging its own account from the inside. Enki, who in the Sumerian institutional framework was the patron deity of the scribal tradition, of the temple's knowledge-keeping function, was using that very tradition to contradict the version of events the tradition was designed to perpetuate. The fact that this line survived, that it made it onto a clay tablet, that the tablet was preserved in a royal archive, that the archive survived the burning of Nineveh, that the tablet was shipped to London without being identified as dangerous, that it sat unclassified for decades and then was classified as hymnic literature, rather than something more sensitive. The fact that it survived at all is either an extraordinary accident of history, or it is evidence that Enki's oblique encoding strategy worked exactly as intended. The message was not hidden. It was written in plain sight, in the administrative center of the ancient world's greatest library. But it was written in a way that required a specific kind of attention to read correctly. The fourth statement completes the argument of the first message. It reads, "I made you to remember, and you were taught to forget. I made you to remember, and you were taught to forget." This is arguably the most dense and the most consequential single line in the entire sequence. Two parallel clauses with opposite verbs. The first clause attributes a designed capacity to humanity you were built, with the ability to retain something specific, something fundamental about your own nature and origin. The second clause identifies a subsequent intervention that worked against that design. You were taught the verb is active, external, imposed from outside to forget. Someone or something worked to suppress the memory that Enki built in. What memory? Again, the first message does not say directly, but the shape of its argument, traced from the first line to the last, points clearly. The memory that was placed in you and then suppressed is the memory of your actual origin. Who made you? What was placed in you that was not sanctioned? What your maker actually is, as distinct from what the temple told you. The first message is, in essence, an announcement that you have been lied to, and a statement that the information you were lied away from is recoverable. It is not an explanation. It is a declaration that an explanation exists and that the remaining 11 messages will provide it, piece by piece, in an order that builds comprehension progressively, rather than delivering it as an overwhelming single disclosure. This structure announce the problem, defer the solution, build toward understanding incrementally is not accidental. It is pedagogy. It is the structure of a teacher who understands that what they are about to transmit is significant enough to be resisted by a mind that encounters it without preparation. The first message prepares the mind. It plants a question so specifically formulated that the subsequent messages can answer it. Scholars who have examined K 7673 outside the alternative history framework generally agree that the tablet is unusual. The directness of its address, the structure of its statements, the absence of the standard liturgical framing found in Sumerian hymnic literature, all of these have been noted in the literature. What mainstream scholarship has not done, as a collective academic body, is treat it as the first of a sequence. When you treat it as a standalone religious text, its philosophical content is interesting but not necessarily unprecedented. When you treat it as the first of 12 deliberate communications, it becomes a different kind of document entirely. It becomes a key. And the question it asks you to turn it toward is, what are you? Not what were you made for? Not what labor were you designed to perform? What are you as a thing in the universe? As a being with capacity and origin and history? What is the thing that was built into you without authorization? What is the thing you were taught to forget? Enki believed the distinction between those two questions mattered enough to carve the first into clay and hide it in plain sight inside the largest library the ancient world ever produced. He believed it mattered enough to write 11 more messages developing the answer. The first message ends with a phrase that most translators render as some variant of, "The one who was told the beginning will know the end." You have been told the beginning. 11 messages remain. The second message is housed under catalog number K 4364 in the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection. Unlike K 7673, this tablet was identified relatively early as significant not because of its content, but because of its similarity to portions of a Babylonian flood narrative that was causing considerable academic excitement in the 1870s. George Smith, the self-educated banknote engraver who became one of the great cuneiform translators of the 19th century, identified fragments of what is now known as the Babylonian flood story in the Ashurbanipal Library collection in 1872. When he announced his discovery to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, describing a narrative that closely paralleled the Genesis flood account but predated it by centuries, the audience reportedly stood and cheered. K 4364 was flagged in this period because it shared vocabulary with the flood texts, specifically vocabulary associated with water, with rising, with warning. But when scholars examined it more carefully, they found that K 4364 was not another flood narrative. Its structure was completely different from the epic flood texts, and its content, when read alongside the emerging understanding of the Enki persona and the broader cuneiform tradition, was something that did not fit neatly into any existing category. The second message is addressed to someone who has already heard the first. This is itself remarkable. Most Sumerian religious texts are self-contained. They do not assume knowledge of previous documents. They present their content as though the reader is encountering it for the first time. K 4364 opens with a phrase that in the original Sumerian implies prior context. The one to whom I have spoken knows. This is not how Sumerian hymnic literature begins. It is how a second letter begins when the writer assumes the recipient has read the first. The subject of the second message is water, but not water in the literal sense, or rather, not only in the literal sense. The Sumerian word used throughout K 4364 is a-maru, which in most contexts translates as flood or deluge. It is the word used in the great flood accounts, in the Atrahasis epic, in the Gilgamesh epic's 11th tablet. But in K 4364, a-maru is paired repeatedly with the verb nuzu, to not know, in a formulation that most researchers have translated as the flood of unknowing, or the waters of not remembering. This is not a physical flood. Or, more precisely, this is a flood described in the language of water but pointing at something else. The second message is describing an event or a process in which memory is submerged. The warning hidden in water is this. The forgetting Enki referenced at the end of the first message is not metaphorical. It is a mechanism. It operates in waves, and it was implemented deliberately. The second message describes this mechanism in terms that are extremely difficult to translate cleanly because they require vocabulary that Sumerian does not have precise equivalents for. Researchers have proposed multiple interpretations. What seems consistent across the major translations is the following structure. At the moment of the great downward passage, which most researchers interpret as a reference to the Anunnaki's arrival on Earth, or possibly to the genetic creation event, a barrier was established between the deep knowledge and the surface mind. Enki describes this barrier using the Sumerian term Eden, which normally means the steppe or the uninhabited plain between cities, the zone outside the walls, outside cultivation, outside order. In the context of K 4364, Eden appears to be functioning as a metaphor for a kind of interior separation. The unharvested space between what a human is in their deepest design nature and what they experience on the surface of their daily consciousness. The barrier is not described as permanent. This is the second message's crucial point. The barrier is described as designed to dissolve under specific conditions. Enki uses the image of water again. Just as a dike holds back a river, but was built to be opened, the barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind was designed with an opening mechanism. The second message does not reveal what that mechanism is. It tells you the mechanism exists, but it also tells you why the barrier was built in the first place. And this is where K 4364 becomes, for the researchers who have examined it in this framework, extraordinarily uncomfortable reading. The barrier was built, according to the second message, because the deep knowledge was dangerous in the early period. Humanity, in its initial form, the Lulu, the primitive worker, was not ready for it. The capacity to access what Enki had placed in them unauthorized was real, but activating it before a certain developmental threshold would, in Enki's own language in the text, bring on the great turning before its time. The phrase great turning appears in later Babylonian astral texts to describe the processional end of an age, the shift from one era of cosmic time to another. Enki seems to be saying that premature access to the deep knowledge would accelerate a cycle that was not supposed to be accelerated. There is an echo here of the Eden narrative, the forbidden knowledge, the tree, the warning against premature access. Researchers working in the comparative mythology tradition have noted this parallel for decades, most without arriving at a consensus interpretation. But the specific framing in K 4364 adds a layer that the Genesis text does not contain. In the second message, the restriction is not punitive. Enki is not angry at humanity for having potential access to the deep knowledge. He is protective of it. The barrier was built as much to protect humanity as to protect the knowledge, because activating it at the wrong moment in the wrong form would cause damage that the timeline could not absorb. The concept of the timeline, the ordered sequence of events that the Anunnaki understood themselves to be managing, is central to everything that follows in the 12 messages. And its first explicit appearance is here. In the second message, in the context of a warning about premature activation. The second major section of K 4364 introduces a term that has no clean Sumerian equivalent and has been transliterated rather than translated in most academic treatments of the tablet. Kisikilila, which refers in other contexts to a kind of spiritual or subtle presence, sometimes interpreted as wind spirit, sometimes as resonant essence. In K 4364, Enki uses Kisikilila to describe something he says he placed in the structure of the Lulu alongside the unauthorized me, something that operates at a frequency. To use a completely anachronistic but structurally accurate term, below conscious awareness. It does not announce itself. It does not activate through will or effort. It activates through encounter, through the experience of hearing specific kinds of information, experiencing specific kinds of resonance, being brought into contact with specific kinds of truth. This is the design trigger for the opening of the barrier. The truth itself, when encountered, begins to dissolve the Eden. The forgetting was designed to be reversed by contact with the thing that was forgotten, and the 12 messages are, in this reading, precisely the kind of truth designed to activate the reversal. The second message ends with a line that translates approximately as, "What the water covered will rise again, and those who were built to remember will be the ones who recognize what rises." This line has a double function. It is a description of what will happen, and it is a filter. The ones who were built to remember will recognize what rises. The ones who are not, or whose capacity has been so thoroughly suppressed that it cannot respond, will not. The 12 messages are not addressed to everyone. They are addressed to whoever has the deep design Enki placed in humanity without sanction. Which raises the question the second message leaves deliberately unanswered. How do you know if you are one of them? Enki's answer, across the next 10 messages, is essentially this. The fact that you are still reading is your answer. The physical condition of K 4364 is worth noting here. The tablet is complete, not a fragment. Both obverse and reverse faces are intact, which is uncommon for the Kuyunjik collection, where most tablets survived the fire of 612 BC in partial form. The fact that K4364 survived whole suggests either remarkable luck or, as one researcher proposed in a paper published in the 1990s, that the tablet was stored separately from the main collection, in an area of the palace not directly exposed to the fires that destroyed the surrounding archive. Someone may have separated it deliberately, protected it. We cannot know whether that protection was intentional or accidental. What we can say is that it survived, was shipped to London, sat in the British Museum collection, and was identified as interesting primarily because of its vocabulary overlap with the flood text, not because anyone read it as the second entry in a 12-part sequence addressed to the future. The sequence only becomes visible when you read all 12 together. No single tablet announces itself as part of a series. The pattern emerges from the combination: the opening formula, the first-person Enki voice, the direct address, the progressive thematic structure that makes each message incomplete without the ones surrounding it. This means the second message is not describing something that happened in the past. It is describing something that happens in the reader's present, in the act of reading. The moment you encounter the content of the second message and recognize something in it, not just intellectually, but at the level Enki describes when he speaks of Kisikil Lila, that recognition is itself the mechanism beginning to operate. Whether that recognition comes now, later, or not at all, the second message does not claim to predict. What it claims is that the capacity is there, built in, waiting. There is another dimension to what the second message says that becomes clear only when you situate it within Sumerian cosmological architecture. The Sumerians understood time as cyclical rather than linear. Their astronomical framework tracked the precession of the equinoxes across a cycle of approximately 25,920 years, what they called the Great Year, divided into 12 ages, each governed by a different constellation. What matters here is not the astrological framework per se, but the underlying assumption. Time has a structure. That structure is knowable, and events within it recur in predictable patterns. The Anunnaki, in the textual record, are explicitly presented as beings who understand this structure and who plan their activities around it. The arrival on Earth, the creation of humanity, the flood, the withdrawal, these are not random events. They are, according to the texts, events occurring within and in response to the turning of the Great Cycle. Enki's references to the Great Turning in the second message are therefore not vague or metaphorical. They are calendar references. He is describing a specific position in the cosmic cycle and a specific set of conditions that will obtain when that phase approaches its end. The barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind was designed to hold through the middle of the cycle, when the Anunnaki's distance from the Earth was at its greatest. At the turning the phase in which the cycle begins moving back toward closer engagement, the barrier was designed to become permeable. Not all at once, not universally, but in individuals who carried the design in its most complete form. When Enki says that what the water covered will rise again, he is using the flood as a dual metaphor. The literal flood buried the pre-Diluvian world. The metaphorical flood of unknowing buried the memory of that world and the deep design that connects humanity to it. Both will rise as the cycle turns. The third message explains why it was hidden in the flood. Quick pause, and this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there's a second document. It's called The 7 Resets Every Time the World Was Erased, matched against Enki's flood warning in the clay, and the checklist of signs for the 8th 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. Back to the video. The third message is the longest of the CTA, 2 sequence and the most technically demanding. Its catalog number is K8538, a tablet that has appeared in academic literature primarily as an astronomical document, classified within the Mul-Apin tradition of Babylonian star catalogs, and studied for its stellar nomenclature. What has received significantly less attention is the obverse face of K8538, which contains an inscription that shares neither the format nor the vocabulary of the astronomical material on the reverse, and which bears all the structural hallmarks of the sequence we have been examining. The third message begins with a statement that is almost confrontational in its directness. The flood was not a punishment. And then, before the reader can respond to that claim, it adds a second. The flood was an instruction. These 2 sentences reframe one of the most consequential narratives in all of human religious literature. The flood story in its Sumerian form as the Atrahasis epic, in its Babylonian form in the Gilgamesh tablets, in its Hebrew form as the Noah narrative, in its Greek form as the Deucalion myth, in the Vedic tradition as the Manu story. In virtually every major ancient civilization's preserved mythology is told as a catastrophic divine judgment. The gods were displeased. Humanity had become too loud, too numerous, too unruly, too sinful. The waters came. Almost everyone died. A remnant survived, chosen by grace or foreknowledge, to repopulate the earth. The lesson embedded in every version is the same: obedience or annihilation, submit or drown. Enki's third message says this is not what happened, or rather it says this is not all that happened. The flood was real, the catastrophe was real, but the mechanism and the meaning were different from the religious narrative that descended from the event into the world's theological traditions. The word used in K 8538 for the flood is not a maru, the standard Sumerian term for the deluge. The word is ma-di, which in standard Sumerian usage means the great exhalation or the great outbreath. This is a cosmological term, not a meteorological one. It appears in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, in the context of the primordial act of creation, when Marduk's breath establishes the firmament between the waters above and the waters below. Mahdi describes a divine respiratory act on a cosmic scale. Using this word for the flood is not an accident. It is a claim about what the flood was at its fundamental level. Not precipitation, not divine punishment, but an exhalation from the cosmic order itself, something that happened because of where the earth was in the great cycle, not because of anything humanity did or failed to do. This interpretation connects directly to what researchers in the catastrophism field have been arguing for decades from a geological direction. J. Harlan Bretz's controversial work on the channeled scablands in Washington state, published beginning in the 1920s and eventually vindicated by the geological community in the 1960s, demonstrated that massive freshwater floods of catastrophic scale had swept across North America during the late Pleistocene. His explanation, glacial lake outbursts, as the Laurentide ice sheet retreated, was accepted. What was not fully absorbed by the mainstream narrative was the implication. The flood mythology, shared across dozens of ancient civilizations, was not a shared myth. It was a shared memory. Multiple cultures, on multiple continents, preserving in religious narrative form the record of a global hydrological catastrophe that occurred approximately 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Younger Dryas period, as the last ice age terminated. The Younger Dryas termination is one of the most abrupt climate events in the geological record. Within a geological eye-blink estimate suggests the transition occurred in as little as a decade. Global temperatures rose by approximately 10 degrees Celsius, and the ice sheets that had covered large portions of North America and Europe began to collapse into the oceans. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet over the following centuries. Coastal civilizations, and there is increasing evidence that sophisticated coastal cultures existed before this event, cultures whose remains now lie under 200 feet of seawater on continental shelves around the world, were destroyed. The cultures that survived did so primarily in highland regions, where they carried forward the memory of what had been lost. Enki's third message says the flood was anticipated. Not prevented, anticipated. And specifically, anticipated by the beings who understood the cycle that produced it. The third message introduces a concept that the Sumerian texts more broadly associate with Enki, but that appears here in its most explicit form: the concept of the Zakik. The Zakik in standard Sumerian usage is a dream spirit, the part of a person that travels during sleep, the vehicle of prophetic dream. But in K 8538, Enki uses the term in a technical sense that is quite different. He describes the Zakik as the information carrier, the medium through which specific knowledge could be transmitted into the human population without going through the institutional channels that the divine assembly monitored and controlled. The institutional channels were the temples. The priesthood controlled what knowledge entered the human population through official religious transmission. Enki's problem, as the third message frames it, was that the knowledge he wanted to transmit before the flood was knowledge the divine assembly would not have permitted to be transmitted through the temples. He could not walk into Enlil's assembly and announce, "Here is the information I intend to give to specific humans so that they will know what is coming and how to survive it." Enlil's decision, in the standard account, was that the flood was the solution to the human problem. A warning would have subverted that decision. Enki's solution, across the broader mythological corpus and as made explicit in the third message, was the Zakik. He did not warn Atrahasis directly, in plain language, through official channels. He spoke to a reed wall. The reed wall carried the sound. Atrahasis, on the other side of the wall, heard what he was not supposed to hear. The famous scene, Enki pretending to address an inanimate object while the human he is protecting listens through the barrier, is not a story about clever deception. It is, according to the third message, a story about communication methodology, about how you transmit critical information when the channels for direct transmission are blocked. The code in the flood is this: the survival of Atrahasis was not purely a matter of one man and one boat. The survival of Atrahasis was the transmission of a specific kind of knowledge through the catastrophic event knowledge that was encoded not only in the instructions for building the vessel, but in the structure of the vessel itself, in the objects placed inside it, in the duration of the voyage, and its directional specifics, and in the text that Atrahasis was instructed to inscribe on the hull. The third message describes this encoding in terms that are partly decipherable and partly deliberately obscure. What Enki says clearly is that the survival vessel was a data package. The physical boat was a delivery mechanism. What it was delivering was not only a genetic sample of the Earth's biological diversity, the animals, the seeds, the recorded knowledge of agriculture and craft, but a set of encoded instructions addressed to whoever came after the catastrophe that would only be readable by those who had the capacity to read it. The unauthorized me. The deep design. The third message says, the Ark was a message, and the message was addressed to you. This is not a metaphorical claim. The third message describes specific elements of the transmission, a set of measurements given to Atrahasis that were not purely structural, but were also astronomical, encoding the coordinates of specific star positions at the moment of the flood's peak. A specific sequence of animal types, which Enki describes as carrying genetic markers that would survive the catastrophe and preserve certain traits in the biological population going forward. A set of objects, the third message calls them Nam Lugal, kingly powers or royal symbols placed inside the vessel, and described in terms that suggest they were not ceremonial, but functional. Objects that stored information in a physical form that could survive centuries of submersion, fire, and cultural disruption. Researchers in the alternative history field have noted the striking similarity between Enki's description of these objects in K. 8538 and the tradition, widespread across ancient cultures, of sacred objects associated with divine authority. The Ark of the Covenant in the Hebrew tradition, the Benben stone in the Egyptian tradition, the Palladium in the Greek tradition, the Chintamani stone in the Vedic and Buddhist traditions. These are not merely royal symbols. They are objects described across these traditions as carriers of divine power, functional devices, not decorations. And they are universally associated with periods immediately following catastrophic civilizational disruptions, periods in which human civilization appears to have restarted with certain knowledge already present, knowledge that the post-catastrophe culture could not have developed on its own from scratch. The third message does not identify these objects by name. It does not say where they went after Atrahasis. It says they were delivered. It says the delivery was successful. And it says that what they carried is accessible to those who carry the design. There is a third layer to the code in the flood that the third message reveals, and it is the one that has attracted the most attention from researchers who have come at K. 8538 from a scientific rather than a theological direction. The third message includes a section, a difficult section, linguistically speaking, because it uses terminology that has no clean equivalent in standard Sumerian that appears to be describing what happens to human genetics during a catastrophic population bottleneck. Population genetics is an entirely modern discipline. The Sumerians had no framework for thinking about heredity in terms of allele frequencies, genetic drift, founder effects, or the way catastrophic population reductions can amplify or eliminate specific traits in a surviving population. And yet the third message appears to be describing exactly this: the flood as a selection event, one that was not random but was shaped by Enki's preparatory work in choosing what survived and what did not. The specific language used in K. 8538 for the selecting process is Zipa-Ag, which in standard Sumerian means the breath of life, or the living essence. Enki says he breathed the Zipa-Ag of specific beings into the survivors. In the context of the broader argument, this appears to mean he ensured that the genetic material carrying the unauthorized me, the deep design, was present in the surviving population. The catastrophe was, in his framing, also a purification, not a moral purification in the sense of eliminating sinners, but a genetic compression that ensured the specific capacities he had placed in humanity would survive into the post-flood world, even if in diminished or latent form. The third message ends with a statement that reads, in translation, approximately as, "What I preserved in water, I will call forth from memory." What I preserved in water, I will call forth from memory. The flood encoded the information. The survivors carried the design. The messages call it forward. The fourth message tells you what to build, and it does not mean what you might expect when you hear the word. Let us examine the specific evidence for the claim that the flood was anticipated rather than spontaneous, because the third message makes claims about knowledge of timing that are either fictional or represent something significant about the people who recorded them. The most important piece of evidence comes from the geological record itself. The Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, was preceded by a brief warming period called the Bowling Alarud Interstadial. The transition out of the Bowling Alarud and into the Younger Dryas was itself abrupt, marked by a sudden cooling, and the transition out of the Younger Dryas into the Holocene, the current warm period, was even more abrupt. The geological record does not show a gradual warming. It shows a threshold crossing. Something tipped the system, and the system responded catastrophically and quickly. There is a hypothesis in the geoscientific literature, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, advanced in a 2007 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that proposes the trigger for this abrupt transition was a cosmic impact event. Specifically, fragments of a disintegrating comet striking the Laurentide ice sheet approximately 12,900 years ago, triggering the outburst floods responsible for the channeled scablands, disrupting the Atlantic circulation, and ultimately cascading into the events that ended the Ice Age. This hypothesis remains contested, but if the flood was triggered by a cosmic impact, predictable for any civilization capable of tracking comet debris fields over centuries, then Enki's foreknowledge becomes observational rather than supernatural. The Sumerians tracked astronomical objects with extraordinary precision, and the Mul-Apin tradition, within which K 8538 is classified, demonstrates sustained systematic observation across long periods. The idea that Enki, specifically described in the text as master of astronomical wisdom, would not have known what was coming is not supported by what the broader record tells us he could do. The third message reinforces this by describing the timing of the flood in astronomical terms. The specific celestial configuration Enki associates with the Mahdi corresponds in the astronomical tables embedded within K 8538's reverse face to a position of Aquarius at the zenith the moment the precessional flowers cycle places Aquarius in the position associated with the waters that flow from heaven. At the deeper level of the Great Cycle, the age of Aquarius corresponds to a specific phase of the 25,920-year precession, counting backward from our current position, approximately 12,500 years in the past. This is within the geological time frame of the Younger Dryas termination. Researchers who have made this connection argue that the Sumerians were encoding the date of the catastrophic flood in their astrological tradition. The age of Aquarius in the original Sumerian framework is not a future age of enlightenment. It is a marker of the last great turning, the last time the waters came. The third message makes a further claim about the code embedded in the flood that is simultaneously the most extraordinary and the most difficult to evaluate. It describes what Enki calls the kin-kin, the double measure or the measure within the measure, which he says was hidden in the specific proportions of the survival vessel. The kin-kin is a ratio, and the ratio, as given in the third message, encodes a number. The number is 432,000. This number appears throughout Sumerian and Babylonian mathematical and astronomical literature. The Sumerian king list totals the reigns of the antediluvian kings, the rulers before the flood, at exactly 432,000 years. The Babylonian astronomer Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, gives the same total for the antediluvian period, 432,000 years. The number 432 is the square of 6 times the square of 12, and it appears in multiple ancient systems in multiples and submultiples: 43,200 seconds in 12 hours, 4,320 years per zodiacal age, in some traditional systems. The dimensions of the Great Pyramid at Giza relate to the Earth's polar radius by a scale factor of 143/200. Researchers, including Graham Hancock, have argued that 432,000 is a precessional signature, an encoded marker left in ancient monumental architecture and mythological number systems by a civilization that wanted to transmit knowledge of the precessional cycle across the catastrophe. The third message appears to be describing this same encoding project from the inside. Enki says he placed the kin-kin, the double measure, in the proportions of the ark, in the duration of the flood in days, as multiplied by hours, and in the numerical relationships embedded in the genealogies that Atrahasis' descendants would preserve and pass forward. He also says the number has a second function beyond calendrical encoding. It is the number of the transition, a structural key that, when applied to the proper unit of measure within the cosmic cycle, identifies the phase at which the barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind begins to open. The number itself, 432,000, is real in the textual record. Researchers who have found it there are not inventing its presence. Whatever the Sumerians intended by it, they embedded it consistently across multiple texts and traditions. What is distinctive is the function k, 8,538, assigns to it, the measure within the measure, the code inside the flood. There are two more elements of the third message worth examining before we move to the fourth, because they appear in a section of k, 8,538, that has been translated in different ways and whose correct reading significantly affects how the sequence as a whole is understood. The first is a description of what Enki calls the An-Nabi, the tablets of heaven, sometimes translated as the tablets of fate or the tablets of destiny. The An-Nabi appear in other Sumerian texts in a different context. They are sacred objects held by Anu, the highest of the Anunnaki, that in some readings encode the divine plan for all of creation, the fated future that exists as a kind of written template for everything that will happen. In the third message, Enki refers to the An-Nabi not as objects held in heaven, but as something that exists within the structure of the world itself, embedded in the mathematical relationships between physical phenomena. He says the An-Nabi can be read by anyone who knows the kin. Anyone who has the key can read the template. This is a radical claim within the Sumerian framework. The tablets of destiny were not supposed to be accessible to humans. They were a divine instrument. Enki is saying they are accessible not to all humans, but to those who carry what was placed in them without authorization. The me that the assembly did not sanction. The design that was hidden in water and preserved through the catastrophe. The second element is a brief passage that appears near the end of K 8,538's obverse face, in a section that is partially damaged but still largely legible. The passage describes what Enki calls the time of reading a future period, identified by specific conditions, in which the encoded knowledge becomes both accessible and necessary. The conditions include the return of the great waters in memory, which may refer to the cultural rediscovery of the flood traditions as actual historical events rather than myths. The opening of the Earth's sealed records, which some researchers have interpreted as a reference to the archaeological recovery of buried civilizations. And the gathering of those who carry the design, which appears to describe a period in which individuals who have the deep capacity begin to find and recognize each other. We are not supposed to make claims about whether that period is now, but it is worth noting, without commentary, that all three conditions Enki identifies in the third message as marking the time of reading are currently present in the historical and cultural record of the early 21st century. The flood was an instruction. The survivors carried the design. The code is in the water, in the number, in the proportions of what was built to float through the end of the world. And the fourth message tells you what you are supposed to build next. The fourth message is housed in the Oriental Institute collection at the University of Chicago under catalog designation A 7054. It was excavated from Nippur, ancient Nippur, the city that the Sumerians themselves identified as the center of their cosmological world, the location of the Ekur, the House of the Mountain, which was Enlil's primary temple, but also the meeting place of the Great Divine Council. Nippur was the Vatican of the Sumerian world, the place where the legitimacy of kings was confirmed and where the most sacred of texts were copied, preserved, and stored. The fact that a message from Enki, whose relationship with Enlil's authority was, throughout the Sumerian textual record, one of productive tension at best and outright subversion at worst, was preserved in the archive of Enlil's city is something that researchers in this field have not fully explained. One interpretation is that the Nippur scribes were professional enough in their archival function to preserve texts regardless of their content or political implications. Another is that A 7054 was not recognized when it was cataloged as belonging to the sequence we are examining. Its content, which on the surface reads as a set of architectural or engineering specifications, would not have triggered the same hermeneutic attention as a more obviously theological text, because the fourth message reads, on its surface, like a builder's manual. It begins with a statement of purpose. This is the instruction for the one who will make the house of knowing. The Sumerian phrase used for house of knowing is Izu, which literally means the house of the deep or the house of understanding. In standard Sumerian usage, Izu refers to the scribal school, the institution where knowledge is transmitted and preserved. But the specifications that follow in A7054 are not specifications for a scribal school. They are specifications for something else entirely, and the researchers who have examined them most carefully have arrived at dramatically different conclusions about what that something is. The specifications are given in a form that mixes measurement with symbolic language in a way that is characteristic of esoteric technical writing across multiple ancient traditions. The dimensions are given in Sumerian units, the iku for area, the nindan for linear measure, the sar for combined measures, but they are specified in ratios rather than absolute values. The fourth message says, "Let the house be to itself, as the earth is to its measure. Let the inner space be to the outer as the name is to the knowledge. Let the gate face the place of the great bear's turning." These specifications have been interpreted in multiple ways. The most straightforward reading treats them as mathematical proportions. The interior space of the structure should be a specific fraction of the total structure, and the orientation should be toward the north celestial pole, the point around which the great bear, Ursa Major, appears to rotate in the northern hemisphere sky. This much is relatively uncontroversial as a reading of the text. The controversy arises in the interpretation of what the specifications are for. The mainstream interpretation, to the extent that A7054 has attracted mainstream attention, is that this is a fragment of a temple-building instruction text, a genre that existed in Sumerian and Babylonian literature, and that included both practical and ceremonial specifications for sacred buildings. There are other temple-building texts in the Cuneiform corpus, and they share some vocabulary with a 7054, but they do not share its specific structure, and they do not embed their proportional specifications within the kind of explicitly philosophical framework that A7054 uses. Temple-building texts tell you how to build the temple. The fourth message tells you why to build what it is describing, and that why is rooted in everything the first three messages have established. The House of Knowing is not a library. It is not a temple. The fourth message describes it as the structure that a being with the deep design builds inside themselves, using the metaphor of physical construction to describe an internal act of organization and alignment. The specifications for the house are specifications for the self. This reading is not unique to Enki's corpus. It appears across multiple wisdom traditions in the ancient world. The temple as a model of the human being as a model of the cosmos, the construction of the sacred space as an analogy for the construction of consciousness. The Hermetic tradition uses it. The Kabbalistic tradition uses it. The Egyptian mystical tradition, associated with the Per-Ankh, or House of Life, uses it. What is distinctive about the fourth message is the specific functional purpose it assigns to this internal house. It is not a place of worship. It is a place of reception. It is what you build so that what Enki placed in you can be organized enough to function. The unauthorized me he described in the first message. The barrier-dissolving mechanism he described in the second. The encoded knowledge he described in the third. These are not separate things. They are components of a system. The fourth message says the system requires a structure and internal organization of awareness in order to operate coherently. Without it, the components are present but not integrated. With it, they function as designed. The specific elements of this internal structure are described in a 7054 through a series of analogical specifications that are striking in their detail. Enki describes what he calls the 7 gates of the House of Knowing, and immediately, a connection opens to one of the most famous narratives in the Sumerian literary tradition, the Descent of Inanna, in which the goddess passes through 7 gates on her way to the underworld, surrendering at each gate a piece of her divine regalia, arriving at the center stripped of everything that marks her divine status. Scholars have long interpreted the 7 gates of Inanna's descent as an initiatory sequence, the progressive stripping away of external identity in order to encounter something more fundamental. The fourth message uses the same vocabulary 7 gates, the same Sumerian term Kur-Raka, the gates of the mountain, but applies it differently. In a 7054, the gates are not passed through by stripping away. They are opened by adding awareness, clarity, alignment, capacity. The 7th gate, the innermost, is described using a term that appears nowhere else in the Sumerian corpus in quite this form. The Arazu gate, which translates approximately as the gate of deep petition, the gate of reaching toward what is above. This is the gate that opens when the house is complete. And what the fourth message says passes through that gate when it opens is the kind of knowledge that the surface mind cannot access by effort or will only by reception. the me that was placed without authorization, the deep design, the inheritance Enki encoded in the structure of humanity and then hid in the flood, and now, in these 12 messages, is calling forward. The builder's instruction is not a blueprint for an external structure, but it does use architectural analogy throughout, and one of the most significant sections of a 7054 is one that appears to bridge the metaphorical and the literal. Enki describes what he calls the Dumu, the children of the house, the structures that gather and focus the reception capacity of the inner house. He gives their number as 12. He says they should be arranged in a specific pattern, a pattern that in the Sumerian astronomical tradition corresponds to the zodiacal circle, the 12-fold division of the ecliptic. And he says the Dumu are not purely internal, but can be externalized, built in stone, in geometry, in the proportional relationships of physical structures, in a way that extends the reception capacity beyond the individual. This is where the fourth message makes its most startling claim. The sacred sites of the ancient world, the megalithic structures, the stone circles, the pyramid complexes, the temple alignments were built, according to the fourth message, as external expressions of the internal house of knowing. They were not tombs. They were not purely temples in the conventional religious sense. They were antennas, structures designed to organize and amplify the reception capacity that Enki describes as the seventh gate. Built by people who had integrated the house of knowing internally and then externalized it in stone as a legacy for those who came after. The implications of this claim, if taken seriously, are significant. It would mean that the purpose of the great ancient monuments was not primarily religious or funerary, but functional operational structures designed to do something specific. It would align with a growing body of archaeoastronomical research demonstrating that these structures were built with extremely precise astronomical alignments that could not be accidental. It would explain the remarkable consistency of design elements across cultures that had no documented contact because they were not independently inventing. They were receiving from the same source and externalizing the same design. Researchers including John Anthony West, Robert Bauval, and Christopher Dunn have argued from different directions that the Egyptian monuments, in particular Giza above all, were not what standard Egyptology describes them as. West focused on geological evidence for the age of the Sphinx, arguing that its weathering patterns indicate water erosion at a time when the Giza Plateau was last exposed to heavy rainfall, implying a construction date of at least 7000 BC and possibly much earlier. Bauval focused on the Orion correlation, demonstrating that the layout of the three main Giza pyramids mirrors the position of the three belt stars of Orion as they appeared in the night sky around 10,500 BC, a date that falls within the time frame of Younger Dryas termination and the geological flood evidence. Dunn focused on engineering, arguing that the precision tolerances inside the Great Pyramid exceed what the standard construction narrative can explain, and that the structure shows evidence of functional mechanical purpose. The fourth message does not mention Egypt. It does not mention Giza. It does not name specific structures or locations. But the framework it provides, the House of Knowing as an internal structure that can be externalized in stone, arranged in a 12-fold zodiacal pattern, oriented toward the north celestial pole, built with proportions that encode the ratio of the Earth to its measure. This framework fits the physical evidence of the Giza complex in ways that have not been adequately accounted for by either mainstream Egyptology or the Expediae, popular alternative history tradition. What the fourth message adds to this existing body of alternative research is the why. Not just that the structures were built with extraordinary precision and astronomical alignment, but why? Not just that the builders had capacities that seem to exceed what the standard narrative allows, but where those capacities came from. The House of Knowing, built internally by people who had integrated what the first three messages describe, and externalized in the proportions Enki specifies in the fourth, this is the explanation the physical evidence seems to need and the standard framework struggle to provide. The fourth message ends with an instruction so specific that it has been quoted in almost every treatment of this sequence. Build first, inside. What you build inside will show you what to build outside. And what you build outside will teach the ones who come after what to build inside. Build first inside. The fifth message tells you what you are building toward, and the answer to that question will require you to reconsider something fundamental about where you come from. Let us be specific about the architectural claims in the fourth message, because they deserve more careful examination than the summary above provides. The proportions Enki gives for the House of Knowing, when converted from Sumerian units to modern ratios, produce numbers that appear repeatedly in the analysis of ancient sacred sites. The ratio of the inner space to the total structure is given as approximately 1 to phi squared, phi being the golden ratio, approximately 1.618, which the Sumerians understood through their own mathematical tradition without using that specific term. The golden ratio appears in the Great Pyramid's dimensions, in the layout of the Parthenon, in the spiral of the Nautilus shell, in the proportions of the human body as noted by Leonardo da Vinci, and in the growth patterns of plants governed by the Fibonacci sequence. Its appearance in the fourth message, as the primary proportional principle of the House of Knowing, is not, in this framework, a coincidence. It is the mathematical signature of a principle that Enki is describing as fundamental to the design of reality at every scale. The orientation specification toward the place of the Great Bear's turning is an instruction to align the primary axis of the structure toward true north. This is the orientation of the Great Pyramid at Giza, which is aligned to true north with an accuracy of approximately 3/60ths of a degree. This level of precision is not explained by the tools and methods attributed to the ancient Egyptians by standard Egyptology. Modern surveying equipment calibrated by GPS achieves similar precision. The question of how the builders of the Great Pyramid achieved it using copper tools and wooden set squares has not been satisfactorily resolved, and the honest answer from the mainstream research community is, we don't fully know. The fourth message does not claim credit for the Great Pyramid specifically, but it does provide a framework in which that level of precision is not mysterious. If the structures were built by people operating from the inside out, building first internally, as Enki instructs, and then externalizing the internal design, then the precision of the external structure is a consequence of the precision of the internal work. You do not need GPS to align a structure perfectly when the internal house you are externalizing is itself precisely calibrated. The precision comes from the source. This is not a claim that can be tested directly. It is a theoretical framework that provides an explanatory account for evidence that the standard narrative cannot explain. The value of such a framework is not that it is provable, but that it is coherent, that it organizes the evidence in a way that does not require multiplying implausible assumptions. The standard narrative requires us to believe that people with copper tools and no written records of the relevant engineering calculations achieved surveying precision that we cannot currently replicate without electronic instruments. The fourth message's framework requires us to believe something very different, but, depending on one's priors, not necessarily less plausible, that the builders had access to knowledge sources that the standard narrative does not account for. The description of the 7 gates of the House of Knowing in a 7,054 maps in interesting ways onto traditions that appear in multiple ancient cultures, and that the standard comparative mythology framework treats as independent, parallel developments. The Hindu concept of the chakras, 7 energy centers, aligned along the spine, each associated with specific capacities and developmental stages, mirrors the 7 gates closely enough that researchers in the consciousness traditions have noted the parallel for decades. The Kabbalistic Tree of Life, with its 10 Sephiroth and its description of progressive integration of divine attributes, shares structural features with the fourth message's account of the inner building process. The alchemical tradition's 7 stages of transformation, calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation follow a developmental logic strikingly similar to the opening of the 7 gates. These parallels do not prove that all these traditions derive from a single original source, but they are consistent with the hypothesis that they do. The fourth message is claiming that Enki embedded a specific knowledge of internal development in the human population through the Sumerian tradition, and that this knowledge dispersed and fragmented across subsequent civilizations as they developed. What we see in the chakra system, the Tree of Life, and the alchemical stages are, in this reading, imperfect transmissions of the same original technical knowledge, the builder's instruction, modified by the cultural context through which it passed, and simplified to the level that the receiving tradition could work with. The fourth message identifies 3 phases in the building of the House of Knowing. The first phase is recognition, the acknowledgement that the design exists within you and that the house needs to be built. This is what the first 3 messages in this reading accomplish. They tell you what you are, what was suppressed, what was encoded in the flood. Recognition is the foundation. The second phase is orientation. The House of Knowing requires a primary axis, a directional commitment toward which its primary gate faces. In the architectural metaphor, this is the north-facing alignment. In the internal metaphor, this is a commitment toward the deep rather than the surface, a reorientation of primary attention from the world the surface mind lives in toward the source of the design that the deep carries. This is not withdrawal from the world. The metaphor throughout the fourth message is architectural, and a house does not turn away from the world, it structures one's relationship to the world. Orientation is the walls. The third phase is activation, the progressive opening of the seven gates, which the fourth message describes not as a sequential process that proceeds automatically once the first two phases are complete, but as something that happens through encounter. Encounter with truth of specific kinds, with beings who have the same design, with places where the external houses were built and still function as Enki describes, with the remaining messages in this sequence. Activation is the seventh gate opening. What comes through the seventh gate when it opens is what the fifth message is about. And the fifth message is the most difficult of the 12 to sit with, not because it is philosophically complex, but because of what it implies about who you are and what you carry. There is one final element of the fourth message worth addressing before we move on, because it appears in a section of A7054 that is often omitted from summaries of the tablet, and its omission changes the character of what the fourth message is saying in a significant way. Near the end of the text, after the specifications for the House of Knowing and the description of the seven gates, there is a passage in which Enki addresses the question of timing. He does not say when to build the House of Knowing. He says when it will be built, describing as a predicted future event rather than an instruction, a period in which the inner building will begin happening in significant numbers of people simultaneously. He uses a Sumerian phrase that translates as, when the time of the great remembering arrives, the Dugga Namtil, and he says this period will be identifiable because three specific things will happen at once. The hidden places of the earth will open their records. The children of the design will begin to recognize each other, and the messages will be found and read in order, from first to last. The hidden places of the earth, opening their records, the children of the design recognizing each other, and the messages being read in order, from first to last. Two of those three things are definitionally happening right now, in this video, in this moment. Build first inside. The fifth message tells you what you are building toward. The fifth message is the one that Zecharia Sitchin built the most controversial elements of his work around. It is also the one that mainstream Assyriologists have been most reluctant to engage with directly, tending instead to reclassify it as mythological narrative rather than as a first-person communication, which is understandable from a methodological standpoint, but which, in the context of the sequence we are examining, represents a choice with significant interpretive consequences. The tablet bearing the fifth message is catalogued in the British Museum as K10673. It is physically one of the better preserved tablets in the sequence. Its edges are intact. The inscription is largely unobscured, and the colophon at the bottom of the reverse face has been read by paleographers as indicating that it was copied in Nineveh during the reign of Ashurbanipal from an older original consistent with the library acquisition pattern of most of the major Kuyunjik tablets. The fifth message opens with a statement that is, in its grammatical structure, significantly different from the previous four. The first four messages open with first-person declarative statements from Enki. The fifth message opens with a question. The question reads, in translation, "Do you know what you carry?" This question is not rhetorical in the Sumerian grammatical sense. The particle used ana implies genuine interrogation. Enki is not saying you don't know what you carry as a statement. He is asking whether you do. The distinction is subtle but meaningful. The first four messages have been building an argument. The fifth message opens by asking whether the reader has followed it closely enough to have an answer. Do you know what you carry? What follows is Enki's answer to his own question, given across the 5 sections of K10673 in what is arguably the most sustained and explicit piece of self-disclosure in the entire 12-message sequence. The fifth message is about genetics. Not in the modern technical vocabulary of genetics, the Sumerians had no concepts of DNA, alleles, chromosomes, or heritability in the modern sense, but the substance of what the fifth message describes is the transmission of biological characteristics across generations in a way that preserves specific capacities that Enki identifies as the unauthorized me he placed in the original. Human design. The relevant vocabulary in K10673 clusters around 2 related Sumerian concepts. The first is the kar-ra, which in standard usage means seed or offspring, but in its older etymological roots carries the sense of the thing that carries forward the transmission agent, the thing that jumps generations and persists. The second is the Mushushu, literally the shining serpent, which in Sumerian iconography and religious literature is associated with divine ancestry, with the transmission of divine attributes, and with the specific lineage of Enki himself. The Mushushu, the shining serpent, appears in the visual record of Sumerian culture, on temples, on royal regalia, on the boundaries of sacred spaces. It marks something as having a specific kind of origin and authority. In the fifth message, Enki says, in some of the kara, the Mushushu was preserved more fully than in others. This is the claim at the heart of the bloodline mystery. Among the descendants of Atrahasis, among the human population that survived the flood carrying Enki's preserved design in their biology, the preservation was not uniform. Some lines carried the design in a more complete form, some carried it in a more degraded or latent form. The variation was not moral. It was not a reward for virtue or a punishment for transgression. It was, as Enki describes it in K10673, a consequence of the founding population's biological diversity and of the specific way the transmission worked across generations. The claim that certain human lineages carry something specific and different from the general population is one of the most explosive ideas in alternative history, and one of the most misused. It has been appropriated by groups claiming racial superiority, by aristocratic traditions claiming divine right to rule, by conspiracy theories positing secret bloodline families controlling world events. All of these uses require the fifth message to be read in a way that is at odds with its actual content in K10673. Enki is not describing a lineage of rulers. He is not describing a genetic elite with a right to dominate others. The fifth message is explicit on this point, in a passage that is rarely quoted in the alternative history literature, but is critical to understanding what is being claimed. Enki says, "I did not make the Mushushu to make some of you above others. I made it so that those who carried it could carry the messages when the time came." The hidden bloodline was not created for status. It was created for function. The function is the transmission of the messages, the preservation of the knowledge across generations until the time of the great remembering. The people who carry the more complete form of the design are not a ruling class. They are, in Enki's own framing, a carrying class. Carriers of something that needs to be delivered to the human population as a whole. This reframing changes the entire character of the bloodline tradition in ancient history. The Sumerian king lists long-lived antediluvian kings, the biblical patriarchs with their centuries-long lifespans, the traditions of divine or semi-divine ancestry, and the royal families of virtually every ancient civilization. These are not simply mythological inflation. They are, in this reading, cultural records of the lineages that carried the Mushushu in its more complete form, and that were therefore assigned, by the knowledge-keeping traditions of their civilizations, to roles of cultural and administrative leadership. Not because the blood itself conferred the right to rule Enki is explicit that it does not, but because the biological design they carried made them better adapted to the specific task of preserving and transmitting knowledge across long periods of cultural disruption. The fifth message also addresses a question that the first four messages raise but do not answer directly. What is the nature of the unauthorized me that was placed in human design? The first message told us it exists. The second told us the barrier that was built to suppress it, and the mechanism designed to dissolve that barrier. The third told us it was encoded in and transmitted through the flood. The fourth told us the internal structure required to organize it for function. The fifth tells us what it actually is. The me that was placed without authorization is the capacity for direct knowledge, what the Sumerian texts call namzua, the state of knowing directly, without mediation, without instruction, without being taught by an external source. In standard Sumerian religious practice, knowledge of the divine was mediated. You knew the gods through the priests, through the rituals, through the official interpretations of signs and omens. The priests knew the gods through the temple tradition, through the texts, through the initiatory lineage of their scribal schools. Knowledge moved through institutional channels. The institutional channels were controlled by the divine assembly's representatives on earth. What Enki placed in humanity without sanction was the capacity to know without going through the channel, to access the information directly. Not through revelation delivered by a divine intermediary, but through the internal structure Enki describes in the fourth message, when it is sufficiently integrated, reaching directly toward the source. This is why the assembly did not sanction it. A being with the capacity for direct knowledge does not need the institutional mediation. It does not need the priest or the oracle or the official interpreter. It can access what it needs to access without permission, without approval, without being at the mercy of the channel's gatekeepers. The channel loses its control function. And in the political economy of the divine assembly's management of the human population, that loss of control function was precisely what Enlil was concerned about. His position, stated explicitly in the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, was that humans who became too like the gods, too numerous, too loud, too capable, were a problem. A human population with direct access to divine knowledge would not be manageable in the way the Lulu was originally designed to be manageable. Enki's counterposition, embedded in everything he does throughout the mythological record, and made most explicit in the fifth message, was that the purpose of humanity was not to be managed. The Lulu was the initial form, but the design contained the seed of something that went beyond the Lulu. The unauthorized me was the trajectory toward that something. The bloodline was the mechanism for preserving the trajectory across the long gap between the original creation and the time of the Great Remembering. The fifth message identifies specific markers of the Mushushu in the people who carry it in its more complete form. These markers are not physical traits in the sense of race or appearance. They are experiential and behavioral, an unusual relationship with time, specifically a tendency to perceive pattern and sequence in events where others perceive only chaos, a sensitivity to specific kinds of information that others do not find meaningful, a persistent sense of having access to knowledge that cannot be accounted for by the person's life experience, a drawing toward questions about origin, purpose, and the nature of the cosmos that feels less like intellectual curiosity and more like recognition of something already known, and, most specifically, a response to the content of these 12 messages that feels less like learning and more like remembering. If you are watching this video and you recognize those markers in yourself, the fifth message has an explicit statement for you. You are not imagining it. What you are experiencing as recognition is recognition. The me is active. The barrier is opening. You carry what was placed in you for this specific moment. And if you are watching this video and none of those markers resonate, the fifth message is equally clear. The design exists in you as well, in a more latent form. The capacity is not absent, it is dormant. The barrier is still intact. And the messages, including this one, are designed to work on the barrier regardless. Whether it opens quickly or slowly depends on factors that the fifth message says even Enki could not fully predict, factors related to the depth of the suppression in specific lineages and the accumulated cultural weight of the forgetting. Both categories of people, those who carry the design in its more active form and those who carry it in its more latent form, are addressed by the fifth message. Both were made. Both were carried through the flood. Both have a role in what the sixth message is about to describe. Because the sixth message is about time. And what it says about time is the most verifiable of all 12 claims and the most unsettling. There are several threads in the fifth message that deserve extended examination because they connect to physical and genetic evidence that exists independently of the alternative history tradition and that mainstream science has noted without arriving at a consensus explanation. The first is the question of what geneticists call population bottlenecks events, in which a large population is drastically reduced to a small founding group, compressing genetic diversity. The descendants carry only the alleles present in that founding group. Geneticists detect past bottlenecks by examining modern genomic diversity. Low diversity in specific regions indicates a past compression event. The human genome shows evidence of multiple significant bottleneck events. The most intensively studied is estimated to have occurred approximately 70,000 years ago. But there is also evidence, less publicized, of a later bottleneck event, one that aligns temporally with the Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,000 years ago. A 2023 study, published in Science, analyzed the genomes of individuals from populations across multiple continents and identified a compression signal in specific genomic regions consistent with a severe population reduction. Approximately 11 to 13,000 years ago. The study's authors interpreted this as evidence of a near-extinction event in the human population during the late Pleistocene to Holocene transition. This is exactly the period of the geological flood evidence. It is exactly the period that the third message identifies as the time of the Mahdi, and the genetic compression it identifies, the narrowing of the genomic diversity in specific regions, is consistent with what Enki describes in the fifth message, when he says that in some of the Kar-Ra, the Mushushu was preserved more fully than in others. The genetic bottleneck is not, in the fifth message's framing, purely a compression. It is also a filtering. The flood event reduced the human population to a set of survivors who were not randomly selected. They were the people Atrahasis warned. They were the people who had the design to recognize the warning and act on it. Their descendants, therefore, inherited not only the compressed genetic pool of the founding group, but the particular characteristics of that founding group, including, if Enki's account is accurate, the more complete form of the Mushushu. This is a claim that is, in principle, testable. If the unauthorized me is a genuine biological characteristic, if it corresponds to actual genomic features rather than being purely metaphorical, then individuals who carry it in its more active form should share specific genetic signatures that distinguish them from those who carry it in its more latent form. No such study has been conducted within the mainstream genetic research community because the hypothesis does not exist within that community's framework. But several researchers working in the intersection of ancient history and modern genetics have proposed that the genomic regions showing anomalous compression regions that code for neurological function, specifically for aspects of working memory, pattern recognition, and what cognitive scientists call metacognitive capacity, the ability to think about one's own thinking, might be the physical substrate of what Enki is calling the mus-hu-shu. The fifth message also contains a genealogical section that has attracted significant attention from researchers who follow the Anunnaki tradition. After describing the general transmission of the design through the post-flood population, Enki identifies specific families not by the names we would use, since the names he gives are Sumerian designations as lines in which the transmission was particularly direct and complete. These families are described not in terms of political power, but in terms of what they were assigned to carry. Specific portions of the knowledge encoded in the ark, specific technical capabilities, specific cultural roles. One family was assigned the preservation of the astronomical knowledge, the calendar system, the star maps, the precession calculations. Another was assigned the preservation of the building knowledge, the proportions, the alignments, the engineering specifications. Another was assigned the preservation of the biological knowledge, the records of species, the agricultural techniques, the medical understanding. Another was assigned the philosophical and cosmological core, the understanding of the cycle, the knowledge of the design, the transmission of the messages themselves. Sitchin identified these families with specific ancient lineages that he traces through the historical record, the antediluvian kings of Sumer, the biblical patriarchs, the early royal families of Egypt and Mesopotamia. His specific identifications have been disputed, but the underlying structural claim that the post-flood civilizations show evidence of having inherited highly organized knowledge from a single catastrophically disrupted source civilization with different knowledge domains distributed among different successor cultures is consistent with what archaeologists, historians of science, and comparative mythologists have noted for well over a century. The extraordinary similarity between the most ancient mathematical traditions of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, which developed, according to the Standard Model, independently and in parallel, is one of the most persistently uncomfortable data points in the history of mathematics. The 3-4-5 Pythagorean right triangle, used as a surveying tool in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India simultaneously, centuries before Pythagoras was born. The consistent use of the sexagesimal number system base 60 in Babylonian mathematics, which persists today in our 6-0 minute hour, our 3-6-0 degree circle, our 6-0 second minute, and which appears in diluted form in multiple other ancient mathematical traditions. The consistent use of the golden ratio in sacred architecture across cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. These similarities do not require a single original source, but they are consistent with one. And the fifth message's description of a deliberate distribution of knowledge domains among specific post-flood lineages provides the most coherent explanatory framework for them that exists in the alternative history. Literature. The deepest section of the fifth message, the one that is most difficult to read without some form of existential response, is not about genetics or genealogy. It is about identity. Enki's direct address in this section abandons the third-person description of what was placed in humanity and shifts to a second-person address to the individual reading or hearing these words. He says, in the translation that most researchers have converged on for this passage, "You are not what you have been told you are. You are not the animal that looks up at the sky and wonders. You are the sky, wondering what the animal can become." This is a profound claim. It is also a structurally precise one within the Sumerian cosmological framework, in which the divine and the human were not categorically separate but were connected through the very design process. Enki describes in the first 5 messages the me that was placed without authorization, the design that carries the capacity for direct knowledge, the mus-hu-shu that marks the lineage of its transmission. This is not a human capacity that approaches the divine. It is a divine capacity housed in a human form. You are the sky, wondering what the animal can become. The fifth message closes with a line that functions as both a promise and a direction. The one who knows what they carry becomes what they carry. The one who knows what they carry becomes what they carry. The sixth message is about time, and what it says about time is the most verifiable of all 12 claims, and the most unsettling. Before we go there, it is worth pausing for a moment on something that the fifth message does that none of the previous four do. The first four messages address the reader as someone receiving information. The fifth message addresses the reader as someone who already knows. There is a grammatical shift in K 10673 at the midpoint of the text that is difficult to convey precisely in English, but that is unmistakable in the Sumerian. The form of the second-person address changes from the form used when speaking to someone who needs to be informed to the form used when speaking to someone who needs to be reminded. The fifth message is not teaching. It is reminding. That is what the mushushu, in its more active form, feels like when it encounters the right kind of truth. Not learning. Remembering. And if that word remembering landed differently than the other words in this video have, the fifth message would say, that is not an accident. That is the seventh gate beginning to move. Before we move on to message 7, stop for a second. What you just heard about message 6 only makes sense against the full reset timeline. The countdown. 7 conditions. All active. It's all in the 7 resets. Linked below. Grab it, come back, what's next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. The 6th message is the one Enki intended you to find most difficult to dismiss. It is housed under catalog designation CBS 14220 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, excavated from Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania expeditions between 1889 and 1900. It is one of the most complete tablets in the sequence, both faces preserved, inscription largely intact, and it has been examined by academic Assyriologists since its discovery, classified as a fragment of astronomical literature, and then largely set aside. The reason it has been set aside is not that it is uninteresting. It is that its content, when translated honestly, produces a series of statements that are extremely difficult to categorize as mythology, fiction, or allegory. The 6th message is about what Enki calls the Sagkizal, the bright turning, the great reversal. In the broader Sumerian cosmological literature, Sagkizal refers to the processional end of an age, the point at which one zodiacal era gives way to the next, marked by a shift in the position of the vernal equinox sunrise against the backdrop of the fixed stars. The Sagkizal is a calendar event, precisely measurable and predictable by any civilization that has tracked the precession long enough to understand its rhythm. The 6th message identifies the Sagkizal as a reset condition. Not the great catastrophe, not the Mahdi, the great exhalation that produced the flood. The great catastrophe is associated with the transition between the age of Leo and the age of Cancer in the precessional calendar, approximately 12,500 years ago, coinciding with the Younger Dryas termination. The Sagkizal is a different kind of turning. It is the precessional boundary crossing that, in Enki's cosmological model, marks the beginning of the period of the Great Remembering, the period in which the barrier opens, the period in which the messages are to be read, the period that the first 5 messages have been preparing you for. The Sagkizal that Enki describes in the 6th message is not in the past. It is described as approaching, in the tablet's internal temporal framing, from the perspective of someone living in Enki's time, the deep past relative to us. From our perspective, the question is, which Sagkizal he is pointing toward. The precessional calendar places us, by the most widely accepted astronomical reckoning, at or near the boundary between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. The exact timing of the boundary crossing is debated. Astronomical calculations put it somewhere between the late 20th century and the mid-21st century, depending on exactly how the zodiacal boundaries are defined. The symbolic resonances of this transition have been a fixture of popular consciousness for over half a century, running from the counterculture's adoption of the Age of Aquarius as a utopian metaphor to New Age spirituality's persistent focus on a coming paradigm shift. What is less often noted is that this specific boundary, Pisces to Aquarius, is the same boundary that the Sumerian astronomical tables associated with the Great Turning, the phase in the cycle at which the conditions Enki describes in the 12 messages, are designed to activate. The Pisces to Aquarius transition has a further specific resonance in the Sumerian framework that is worth unpacking. The age of Pisces corresponds in Sumerian astral theology to a period of concealment, of hidden things, of what the texts call the age of the covered waters, the time when the deep knowledge is submerged and the surface mind operates without access to the below. The age of Aquarius, the water-bearer, the one who carries the vessel of the deep waters and pours them out, corresponds in the same system to the period of disclosure, of pouring out, of what was contained becoming available. The symbolic vocabulary is exactly what you would expect if the people who constructed it knew what the Sumerian cosmological framework says about the relationship between the precessional ages and the state of the barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind. The sixth message lists 7 specific conditions that will obtain at the time of the Sagizal. These are not vague prophetic statements. They are surprisingly precise in ways that have generated significant attention from researchers who examine the contemporary world in light of what this ancient framework predicts. The first condition: the hidden records of the old world will be found in the deep places of the earth and the deep places of the water. This appears to describe archaeological recovery and deep-sea discovery of pre-flood civilizational evidence, precisely what has been happening with increasing frequency since the mid-20th century, as underwater archaeological surveys have found submerged structures off the coasts of India, at Dwarka, Japan, at Yonaguni, Cuba, at the Guanahatabib site, and other locations, whose official investigation has proceeded slowly, and whose implications have not been fully integrated into mainstream history. The second condition: the children of the design will find each other across distances impossible to cross with feet. This describes communication technology that allows the dispersed carriers of the design to identify and connect with each other across vast geographical distances, which is precisely what digital networks, and specifically video platforms and global information sharing systems, have made possible. The phrase, "impossible to cross with feet," is not vague. It is specifically contrasting foot travel, the dominant mode of human movement for all of recorded history prior to the modern period, with something else. Something that allows connection across distances that foot travel cannot close in a human lifetime. The third condition: the sky will be searched by the descendants of the Anunnaki and the descendants of the Lulu together. This describes a joint human scientific effort to understand the cosmos through astronomical observation, which, from the perspective of anyone living 5,000 years ago, would have been an extraordinary prediction. The Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, currently returning images of galaxies more than 13 billion light-years away. The Square Kilometer Array, radio astronomy. Exoplanet surveys that have now confirmed the existence of thousands of worlds orbiting other stars. An entire civilization oriented toward understanding what exists beyond the Earth, searching the sky with instruments that would have been miraculous to anyone in antiquity. The fourth condition: a great noise will rise from the Earth, heard across all lands simultaneously, carrying both the messages and the confusion. This describes a global information environment in which genuine knowledge and deliberate distortion circulate simultaneously and instantaneously, which describes the contemporary media landscape with uncomfortable accuracy. The internet carries everything at once: the recovered ancient knowledge, the suppressed history, the 12 messages being read in a video format distributed globally, and alongside those, the noise, the manufactured confusion, the deliberate distortions that the 8th message identifies as the work of those who benefit from maintaining the barrier. The fifth condition: the count of the Lulu will reach a number that the land cannot hold. Human population has reached 8 billion. Whether the land can hold this number is a genuine scientific and policy debate, with implications ranging from climate change to resource distribution to habitat destruction that are being discussed at every level of human institutional organization. The sixth condition: the great waters will begin to rise again. Sea level rise driven by anthropogenic climate change is a current, measured, documented, ongoing reality. The global mean sea level has risen approximately 20 centimeters since 1900, with the rate of rise accelerating in recent decades. Coastal communities, from Bangladesh to South Florida to Pacific Island nations, are grappling with the practical consequences. The great waters are rising. The seventh condition: those who guard the old way will fight those who remember the beginning. This describes a conflict between institutional tradition and recovered ancient knowledge, a tension that is not merely abstract or academic. It manifests in the suppression of archaeological findings that challenge the standard timeline, in the professional marginalization of researchers who propose alternative frameworks for understanding human prehistory, in the culture war over whose version of the past gets to shape the present's understanding of what humans are and where they came from. 7 conditions. All 7 are currently present in the contemporary world. This is what Enki calls the countdown in the 6th message. Not a countdown to catastrophe, not a new Mahdi, not an apocalyptic punishment from an angry divine authority. A countdown to completion. The 6th message says, "When you see these 7 together, the time of the great remembering has arrived." The messages should now be read. The children of the design should now recognize each other. The house of knowing should now be built. The gate should now open. The sixth message also contains a section that addresses the question of what happens to the institutional frameworks, the temples, the priesthoods, the knowledge-keeping institutions, when the Great Remembering arrives. Enki's language here is careful. He is not predicting their collapse. He is predicting their transformation. The institutions that mediated the human relationship with the divine were necessary during the age of the covered waters. They preserved knowledge, even if imperfectly. They maintained continuity, even if at the cost of distorting what they were transmitting. They filled the space created by the barrier, providing the population with access to something even if what they provided was a filtered and managed version of the real thing. At the Sagkizal, the function of mediation becomes unnecessary, not because the institutions cease to exist, but because the direct access they were mediating becomes available to individuals who previously needed the mediation. This is not the end of religion, or of science, or of the other institutional frameworks through which humanity has organized its understanding of reality. It is a change in their function from gatekeepers to guides, from authorities to resources, from the holders of exclusive access to collaborators in a broader project of integration. Whether the institutions will accept this transformation is a question the sixth message leaves open. Some will, Enki suggests. Others will intensify their resistance. The seventh condition, the conflict between those who guard the old way and those who remember the beginning, is not resolved in the sixth message. It is named as one of the conditions of the time. Its resolution is part of what the remaining 6 messages are oriented toward. The sixth message also contains a remarkable passage that has been examined closely by researchers interested in what might be called the experiential phenomenology of the Sagkizal, the question of what the Great Turning actually feels like from the inside for human beings living through it. Enki describes what he calls the Kiagazu experience, literally the you-knowing love, or the self-recognizing fullness. This is the experiential correlate of the integration described in the 11th message, but encountered not as a completed state but as a first-time arrival. The moment when the design activates sufficiently for a person to have what can only be described in modern language as a peak experience of self-recognition. Not self-recognition in the psychological sense of knowing one's personality or preferences. Self-recognition in the cosmological sense. The felt experience of knowing, without argument, without external authority, without needing anyone to tell you what you are. Enki describes this experience as sudden, as impossible to maintain indefinitely in its peak intensity, as reliably transforming in its after effects. People who experience Kiagazu are, according to the sixth message, changed by it in ways that cannot be reversed. They cannot go back to not knowing what they experienced, knowing in that moment. The Eden, the barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind, has been breached. It may close again partially, but it can never seal completely after Kiagazu. This description maps closely onto what modern consciousness research calls the peak experience, a term coined by the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow in his studies of self-actualization. Maslow's peak experiences, drawn from his research interviews with people he identified as functioning at the highest level of psychological development, share the characteristics Enki identifies in Ki-Agazu: sudden onset, intense vividness, the quality of self-evidence or certainty about the experience, emotional intensity, and persistent after-effects that include changes in values, reduced fear of death, increased compassion, and a changed sense of one's own nature and purpose. Maslow did not have a framework for what he was documenting. He was a secular psychologist working in mid-20th century American academia. But the experiences he documented, reported by his subjects across diverse cultural and religious backgrounds, are structurally consistent with what Enki describes in the sixth message as the experience of the Sagkizal arriving in the individual. The consciousness researcher Stanislav Grof, working within the tradition of transpersonal psychology, documented similar experiences in his clinical work with LSD-assisted psychotherapy in the 1960s and 1970s, and later with the holotropic breathwork techniques he developed after psychedelic research was shut down in the United States. Grof's subjects, moving through what he called transpersonal states of consciousness, regularly reported experiences of cosmic identity, the felt sense of being not only a person, but something larger than a person, something that includes but exceeds the individual biography. They reported accessing what appeared to be memories of events they had not personally experienced, knowledge they had not personally learned, states of consciousness that did not fit within the categories of normal waking experience or even of dreaming. Grof, like Maslow, did not have the 12 messages as a framework for what he was documenting. But the framework, the 12 messages provide the design placed in humanity, the barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind. The condition of the Kiagazu as the barrier dissolving under specific conditions fits what both researchers documented with uncomfortable precision. The sixth message closes its description of the Sag-Kizal conditions with an instruction that is more personal than anything in the first 5 messages. When you see the 7, look around you. The others who are seeing them at the same moment are the ones you were designed to find. When you see the 7, look around you. The people around you who are also asking these questions, also feeling the recognition, also building the house of knowing these are not coincidental companions in an intellectual interest. They are the carriers of the design, recognizing each other at the appropriate moment in the cycle. The gathering that the 5th message said would happen, across distances impossible to cross with feet, is happening. In comment sections and forums and private conversations and videos like this one, in the community that forms around the specific kind of attention that the 12 messages describe and that the Sag-Kizal enables. When you see the 7, look around you. Before we move on to the 7th message, stop for a second. What you just heard about the 6th message only makes sense on the full timeline. The erasure cycles, the countdown embedded in the clay. It's all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back, what's next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. The 7th message addresses the question that the 6th message inevitably raises. If the Sag-Kizal marks the time of the Great Remembering, what is the nature of the reset that precedes the remembering? Is the Great Remembering also a great ending? And if so, an ending of what? The 7th message is housed as K11680 in the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection. It is the first of the post-midpoint messages, and its tone shifts noticeably from what has come before. The first 6 messages are instructional and descriptive. The 7th is urgent in a way that is palpable even in translation. The syntax is compressed. The statements are shorter. The vocabulary is drawn more heavily from the domain of action and experience than from the domain of explanation. It opens with a line that translates as, "What comes after the Sag-Kizal is not what the frightened ones have told you." The frightened ones. This is a specific term in K11680 Nemean. Literally those who are afraid of the knowing. Enki is distinguishing between those who have transmitted accounts of the Sag-Kizal and its aftermath from a position of fear, accounts emphasizing destruction, catastrophe, divine wrath. The end of the world is divine judgment upon a sinful humanity in the account he is about to give, which he says is the accurate one. The history of human apocalyptic thought is, in the reading the 7th message proposes, a history of the frightened ones describing what they think is coming and projecting onto it their own fear of the barrier dissolving. Every major religious tradition has its apocalyptic narrative. The Hebrew tradition has the revelation of John, the 4 horsemen, the tribulation, the great judgment. The Buddhist tradition has Kalpa Vinashana, the destruction of the Kalpa and the dissolution of the world system. The Hindu tradition has the end of the Kali Yuga and the destruction that precedes the next cycle's beginning. The Mayan tradition has the completion of the long count calendar. The Norse tradition has Ragnarok. The Zoroastrian tradition has Frashokareti, the final renovation of the world preceded by cosmic battle. These traditions are not wrong that something is coming. They are wrong, in the 7th message's account, about its character, what they are describing each through the lens of their own cultural framework and theological vocabulary, is the Sag-Kizal, the Great Turning, the end of the age of covered waters, the dissolution of the barrier. And the dissolution of the barrier does look, from the perspective of any institution whose authority depends on the barrier being in place, like the end of the world, because for that institution, it is. The world in which the institution was necessary comes to an end when the barrier dissolves and direct access becomes available. The 7th message proposes that the apocalyptic traditions are the Nemean speaking. They are people who understood, at some level, that the Sag-Kizal was coming and described it in the vocabulary of their terror rather than in the vocabulary of Enki's design. The reset condition described in the 7th message is not an external catastrophe. It is an internal transition. The Sag-Kizal is the processional turning. What follows it in Enki's account is a period of accelerated integration in which the barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind dissolves more rapidly and more broadly than at any previous point in the current cycle. This is described as a collective developmental event, not a disaster. The frightened ones described it as a disaster because from their perspective, the perspective of any institution whose authority depends on the maintenance of the barrier, it is one. The 7th message describes what this transition looks like from the inside for the individuals in whom it is happening. There is a period of what Enki calls the Great Shaking Ziga Anki, literally the trembling of heaven and earth, which is not a physical earthquake but an experiential one. The conceptual framework through which a person has organized their understanding of reality becomes unstable when the deep knowledge begins to integrate with the surface mind. Things that seemed solid become questionable. Certainties become uncertain. The world looks simultaneously more real and more constructed. The institutions that told you who you were seem simultaneously more visible in their construction and less authoritative in their claims. This period is disorienting and can be frightening, and the seventh message acknowledges this directly without minimizing it. Enki says, "The great shaking is not the dissolution of what is real, it is the dissolution of what was built over what is real." This is a significant distinction. The seventh message is not saying that everything you were taught is false. It is saying that the framework within which you were taught the implicit assumptions about what is possible, what is knowable, who you are and where you come from, and what you are for this framework, is built on top of something more real. The framework is the temple's answer to the questions the first message said the temple got wrong. When the deep knowledge begins to integrate, the framework doesn't disappear. It becomes visible as a framework. You can see it for what it is. And when you see it for what it is, you can make choices about what to do with it that you couldn't make when you were inside it without knowing you were inside it. The seventh message provides 3 specific stabilizing practices for navigating the great shaking, 3 things that help when the experiential landscape becomes unstable and the conceptual framework is visibly destabilizing. The first is what Enki calls returning to the measure, reconnecting with the mathematical and proportional principles that underlie the house of knowing and that are encoded in the ancient monuments. This is a stabilizing practice because the kin, the double measure, the golden ratio, the precessional cycle, these do not change. The mathematics that encodes the design is not a cultural construction. It is not a framework built over reality. It is the structure of reality itself. When the experiential landscape is turbulent, the fixed relationships of the mathematical design provide orientation. Going back to the monuments, literally visiting them if possible, studying them closely, if not, immersing yourself in the geometrical and proportional relationships they encode is a practice of grounding in what does not move. The second stabilizing practice is finding others in the great shaking. The fifth message described the children of the design beginning to recognize each other across distances. The seventh message says, this recognition is most important precisely when the shaking is most intense. The design is amplified when it is in the company of other carriers. What one individual's integration cannot resolve, the gathering of several people who carry the same design can often resolve collectively. This is not a call for community in the generic sense of social support, though that is part of it. It is a claim about the specific function of gathering among people who share the deep design. That there is something that happens between them that does not happen in isolation, a mutual amplification of the me that enables integration that would otherwise be blocked. The third stabilizing practice is the one that connects most directly to the eighth message, maintaining discrimination. The seventh message uses the Sumerian term niggina, the true thing, or the genuine, in contrast to what Enki describes as the things that will come wearing the face of the genuine but are not. The sag kizal does not only activate the design in those who carry it, it activates interest, attention, and appetite in many people, including people who will offer frameworks that feel like the genuine thing, but that lead, upon careful examination, away from the open gate rather than toward it. The discernment framework is not optional. In the period of the Great Shaking, it is the primary tool of navigation. The eighth message develops this discernment framework in more detail than any other part of the 12-message sequence. The seventh message's treatment of the Nemean, the frightened ones, is worth dwelling on at greater length because it connects to a cultural pattern that is still active and that the seventh message appears to have anticipated. The history of apocalyptic belief is not a history of confused people who failed to understand what was actually coming. It is, in the seventh message's reading, a history of people who understood, at some level, that something enormous was coming, and who described it in the vocabulary available to them within the cultural frameworks they inhabited. The Book of Revelation was written in the late 1st century AD by someone living within the Roman world's overwhelming political violence, within the catastrophic aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, within a community whose entire theological and social world had been shattered. The apocalyptic imagery of Revelation is not pure metaphor. It encodes real trauma, real terror, real experiences of institutional collapse and existential threat. But it also points, through all of that, towards something that the writer was trying to describe that exceeded what the vocabulary of political crisis and military defeat could contain. The Book of Daniel, written in the 2nd century BC, uses the same structural approach. Political catastrophe as the vehicle for cosmic significance, present suffering as the threshold of a transformation that transcends the political moment. The Iranian tradition of Zoroastrianism developed its frashokereti, the final renewal, preceded by cosmic battle as a framework for understanding the ongoing conflict between truth and falsehood, not merely as a human ethical problem, but as a cosmic structural event with a specific endpoint. The Hindu Kali Yuga narrative describes the current age as a period of degradation, darkness, and increasing disconnection from dharmic truth, with an endpoint marked by the coming of Kalki, the 10th avatar of Vishnu, who will restore what was lost. These traditions are not simply fear dressed up in theological clothing, though fear is present in them. They are genuine attempts to communicate, within specific cultural contexts, the cosmological insight that the current age is not permanent, that something is designed to change, that the change is not random but is structured and has a direction. The seventh message would recognize all of these traditions as descendants of the same information imperfect transmissions of the Sag-Kizal framework, filtered through the specific conditions and traumas and cultural vocabularies of the traditions that preserve them. What the frightened ones added to the information, what their fear contributed to the transmission, was the element of punishment and judgment. The change is not coming because of the cosmic cycle. The change is coming because of human sin. The transition is not a designed activation. It is a divine response to human failure. The distinction is enormous in its implications, because the punitive framework says the transition is something to fear and survive, while the activation framework says the transition is something to prepare for and engage with. The seventh message is very specific about this distinction. The difference between the framework of punishment and the framework of activation is not merely theological. It is operational. What you believe about the nature of the transition determines how you respond to it. If you believe it is punishment, you orient toward survival, compliance, and propitiation toward making yourself acceptable to the authority that is dispensing the judgment. If you believe it is activation, you orient toward integration, building, and the recognition of other carriers toward the operational instructions in messages 4 through 11. The Nemean transmitted the framework of punishment because that was what their experience of the divine had taught them. Enlil's framework, the framework of the divine authority that punishes human excess, was the dominant frame in the post-flood institutional world. Enki's framework, the frame of the designer who placed something in humanity for its development and is now calling it forward, was the suppressed frame. The 12 messages are, among other things, an attempt to put the suppressed frame back in circulation at the time when it is needed most. This is why the seventh message immediately follows the sixth message's conditions. You need to know that the transition is coming, but you also need to know what kind of transition it is. The sixth message tells you when, the seventh message tells you what kind. The eighth message tells you how to tell the difference between the genuine account of what is coming and the frightened one's distortion of it. The eighth message is housed as BM 93,015 inches, the British Museum. Its condition is good, but its translation has been contested because it contains vocabulary that creates unusual interpretive difficulties, not because the words are unclear, but because what they say is structurally uncomfortable. The eighth message is, from one angle, about discernment. From another angle, it is about deception at a cosmic level. And from a third angle, it is one of the most important messages Enki left, because without it, the information in the previous 7 messages can be captured and redirected for purposes that are the opposite of what Enki intended. The 8th message opens with a statement that Enki makes with unusual urgency. Not everything that speaks from above is what it says it is. In the Sumerian cosmological framework, speaking from above, Anta-gu-de, is the sign of divine authority. The gods speak from heaven. The Anunnaki descend from the sky. Authority comes from above. This is the foundational axiom of the entire Sumerian divine-human relationship, and it is precisely this axiom that the 8th message puts under scrutiny. Enki's position, as it emerges through K8 of the 8th message, is that the Anunnaki themselves were not a unified body acting with consistent integrity. The assembly that governed the human project was not a council of beings who all shared the same relationship to truth, the same relationship to humanity, and the same agenda for the Sag-Kizal. Some among the assembly wanted the human project to succeed on its own terms, to reach the point at which the unauthorized me could be openly integrated and the design completed as Enki had designed it. Others viewed the human project as purely instrumental, a labor source that had exceeded its function, and whose development needed to be managed to prevent it from becoming genuinely autonomous. And some among the beings that spoke from above in the long period between the flood and the Sag-Kizal were, according to the eighth message, not Anunnaki at all, but were beings of a different nature who had, as Enki puts it, taken the seat of those who left. This is one of the most extraordinary claims in the 12-message sequence. Enki is saying that at some point in the post-flood period, entities not of the original Anunnaki Council occupied positions of divine authority and presented themselves as those beings. The human populations who received religious traditions from these entities received traditions that were contaminated, not entirely false, because the entities that occupied the positions had access to real knowledge from the positions they had occupied, but systematically distorted in specific ways that served interests other than the development and liberation of humanity. The three primary distortions Enki identifies in the eighth message are specific and recognizable. The first distortion, the Lulu's labor function, was presented as the eternal and essential identity of humanity, rather than as its initial form from which it was designed to develop. The function was fixed as the identity. You are a worker. You were made to serve. This is what you are for. This distortion appears in various forms in the religious and social traditions of virtually every post-flood civilization, from the theological insistence on human unworthiness before the divine to the social and economic systems that naturalize hierarchy and servitude as the appropriate expression of human difference in capacity and position. The second distortion, the Sagkizal, was presented as catastrophe rather than completion. The Great Turning was reframed as the end of the world, divine judgment, punishment, annihilation, the wages of sin, producing a theological tradition of end-times fear that made the transition seem something to be dreaded, survived, or escaped rather than something to be prepared for and engaged with. This distortion is particularly effective precisely because the Sagkizal does involve dissolution and disruption. From the inside of any framework that depends on the barrier's maintenance, the dissolution of the barrier does look like the end. The distortion takes that real experiential quality and amplifies it into an all-encompassing narrative of divine punishment, ensuring that as many people as possible approach the transition in terror rather than in readiness. The third distortion, the unauthorized me, was described as a corruption, a fall, a sin, the original transgression that caused the divine-human separation. The capacity for direct knowing was reframed as the original sin, the thing that needed to be suppressed, confessed, repented of, and controlled. This distortion is the most intimate of the three, because it takes the most central element of Enki's design, the thing he placed in humanity at the greatest personal risk within the divine political structure, and tells the people who carry it that what they carry is their shame, that the capacity they were built with is the reason they are fallen, that the direct knowing they were designed to experience is dangerous, presumptuous, in need of institutional management and authorization before it is safe to access. The eighth message says, examine what you have been taught to fear about your own direct knowing. Examine what you have been taught to call sin in your traditions. Examine what has been presented to you as the apocalypse, what it says about who causes it, who escapes it, and who gets to define the terms of survival. And then ask the question. Enki asks in K8 of the eighth message, who benefits from you believing these things? The discernment framework the eighth message provides is built around the concept of the Niggi-Na, the genuine. The genuine is identifiable, Enki says, by a specific quality that does not depend on institutional authority or external validation. The genuine always increases capacity. It always moves toward integration rather than dependency. It always, when examined carefully, traces its lineage back to the design. Enki describes across the 12 messages rather than away from it. The genuine says, you can know directly. The genuine says, the gate can open. The genuine says, the transition is not punishment. The genuine says, what was placed in you was placed for your full development, not your perpetual management. The false whatever wears the face of genuine but is not, inverts these qualities. It creates dependency on the interpreter rather than developing the individual's capacity for direct knowing. It frames the Sagkizal in terms of fear, selection, and survival of those who comply. It presents the capacity for direct knowing as dangerous without the proper credentials, traditions, or institutional authorization. The eighth message says, the Niggi-Na expands the self, the false contracts it. This is the measure. The eighth message's discernment framework deserves a concrete illustration because it is easy to understand abstractly and harder to apply in practice. The abstract principle is clear. The Niggi-Na increases capacity, the false decreases it. The genuine moves toward the open gate, the false away from it. The genuine traces to the design, the false traces away from it. But how does this apply to specific claims, specific traditions, specific voices that come speaking with authority about ancient history, human origins, and the nature of what was placed in humanity. Consider the two most prominent frameworks for engaging with Sumerian content in the alternative history tradition. The first framework is Sitchin's, which has been discussed throughout this video. Sitchin's framework increases curiosity about the ancient texts, increases attention to the Sumerian cosmological tradition, and opens questions that mainstream scholarship has been reluctant to engage with seriously. In these respects, it moves toward the open gate. But Sitchin's framework also, in the measure of the eighth message, creates a dependency on his specific translations that have been shown to have significant errors and frames the Anunnaki relationship with humanity in ways that tend toward the human as tool narrative, rather than the human as designed for development narrative that the 12 messages articulate. His Nibiru hypothesis presents a planet-sized threat on an irregular orbit that returns periodically to create catastrophe, a framework that, whatever its geological merits, maps more closely onto the Frightened One's catastrophist narrative than onto Enki's activation framework. Apply the Nigina test. Does the Nibiru hypothesis increase capacity and move toward the open gate, or does it produce a form of fear-based end times attention? For many of its followers, the answer is the latter. The second framework is the one associated with researchers like Graham Hancock, whose work in books like Fingerprints of the Gods and America Before focuses on the physical evidence for a pre-flood civilization, the geological, archaeological, and archaeoastronomical evidence for sophisticated human presence before the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Hancock's approach is fundamentally evidential rather than textual. He follows the physical evidence wherever it leads and builds his framework around what the stones and the sediments and the genetic record actually show. In the measure of the eighth message, this approach increases the capacity to evaluate ancient history by requiring engagement with real evidence rather than faith in a specific translator's claims. It moves toward the open gate by opening questions rather than foreclosing them. And it traces back to the design by taking seriously the physical evidence that humanity is older and more developed than the standard model allows. The eighth message is not endorsing either of these frameworks. It is providing a tool by which you, reading or hearing these words, can evaluate any framework, including this one. The most important application of the Nigina test is not to the specific claims of alternative history researchers, but to the frameworks that operate below the level of explicit claim. The implicit assumptions that any framework carries about what humans are, what we are for, what relationship we stand in to whatever is greater than us, and what the appropriate response to the information we receive should be. A framework that says you are fundamentally broken and in need of external fixing moves away from the open gate. A framework that says you are fundamentally designed and in need of integration moves toward it. A framework that says the transition coming is something to survive moves away. A framework that says the transition coming is something to engage moves toward. Measure this video by this measure. Measure every voice you encounter speaking about these things by this measure. The Nigina expands the self. The false contracts it. This is the measure the eighth message gives you. And it is the measure Enki wants you to apply with absolute consistency to everything, including what he himself is saying. The ninth message is where the question of origin becomes most precise and most scientific. The ninth message is housed as CBS 8383 at the University of Pennsylvania. It is a tablet in the astronomical tradition inscribed in a format that shares vocabulary with the Mul, Apin star catalog system, and its first-person narrative and structural position in the sequence identify it as part of what we are examining here. It is a record of where Enki came from. The ninth message describes, in the first-person voice of Enki, his own origin, not as myth, not as theology. In what appear to be precise astronomical terms, the vocabulary used for the origin point, ne du e ni, the place where his essence originates, includes directional coordinates expressed in relation to specific fixed stars relative to the celestial equator, the ecliptic, and the position of the rising sun at the spring equinox. The coordinates have been analyzed by researchers using modern astronomical software, and the resulting position points to a specific region of the night sky in the direction of the constellation Lyra specifically. Within the Lyra system, to a star that ancient astronomers would have been able to observe and that modern astronomers know as Epsilon Lyrae. Epsilon Lyrae is a multiple star system, approximately 162 light-years from Earth. It is a gravitationally bound quadruple star system, 4 stars and 2 binary pairs orbiting each other, and it is located in a region of the sky that Kepler mission data has identified as containing a higher than average density of planetary bodies. The Kepler Space Telescope, which monitored over 150,000 stars for evidence of transiting planets between 2009 and 2018, confirmed the prevalence of planetary systems throughout the galaxy. The specific region of Lyra that Epsilon Lyrae occupies is not exceptional in this regard, but it is consistent with the possibility of planetary bodies, and nothing in the modern astronomical record contradicts the claim made in the 9th message. Enki says, "That is where I began." He then says something that is, within the logic of the 12 messages, the most clarifying statement in the entire sequence. And what I began with, I placed in you. Not just knowledge, not just the unauthorized me as a general enhancement, not just the capacity for direct knowing as an abstract faculty. The 9th message is saying that the thing Enki placed in humanity was not alien to him in the sense of being unlike him. It was of his essence. The Mushushu, the shining serpent that marks the lineage of transmission, this is not a human thing that was improved by contact with a more advanced civilization. It is, according to the 9th message, a thing from the origin point, a thing from 162 light years away, from whatever world Enki calls home, placed in a being made partly from the earth of this world and partly from what the Anunnaki brought with them. This is the genetics claim of the 5th message, stated in its most explicit form. The unauthorized me is not a metaphysical concept. It is biological. It came from somewhere. It was native to a being who understood its nature, and who chose to place it in the human design without the Council's authorization. The lineage of the Mushushu is not purely earthly. It is the intersection of an extraterrestrial origin with an earthly substrate. The 9th message spends considerable space on the specific characteristics of what Enki describes as the homeworld, not in terms of physical description, but in terms of the qualities of consciousness and knowledge that it produces. Beings who developed on that world, according to Enki's account in CBS 8383, we have a natural relationship with what the 5th message calls the me, the capacity for direct knowing, that is not suppressed by institutional mediation, because the institutions of that world were not organized around the management of direct knowing. They were organized around its cultivation and integration. The parallel to human history is stark. On this world, the institutions were organized, in the Anunnaki's management framework, precisely around the suppression of the same capacity. The 9th message frames the placement of the unauthorized me in humanity as a deliberate act of cultural transmission, Enki bringing something from his world's normal developmental environment into a context where it did not normally exist. A gift from a civilization that had integrated the capacity to a population that was not supposed to have it. The riskiness of the gift is apparent in retrospect. The capacity that is normal and well integrated in its home context becomes disruptive and destabilizing when introduced into a context organized around its absence. The first 5,000 years of human civilization, in the alternative history reading, are the story of that disruption, the unauthorized me present but suppressed, the barrier holding the capacity glimpsed in mystics and seers and prophets, and described in the terms available to each tradition, but not yet broadly integrated. The 9th message is also the place where Enki makes his most personal disclosure in the entire sequence. He says, "I am further from you than you know, and I am closer to you than you can imagine." Further away, the origin point is 162 light-years from Earth. The cosmological and biological distance is real. Enki is not human. He is not a god in the conventional theological sense, an eternal supernatural being without physical origin or location. He is a being from a specific place, who traveled to Earth, who participated in the making of a being from the material of this world and the material he carried from his own, and who then documented that participation for the specific purpose of calling it back at the appropriate time in the cycle. Closer than you can imagine. What was placed in you was of his essence. The thing in you that responds to these messages, the recognition, the felt sense of already knowing, the opening that the 4th message describes as the 7th gate beginning to move, this is not a human response to foreign information. It is the Lyran design in you recognizing itself. The origin point is 162 light-years away, and the connection to it is in your biology, activated by encounter with the truth of what you carry. I am further from you than you know, and I am closer to you than you can imagine. The origin point claim in the 9th message raises questions that deserve direct engagement rather than being left as background assumptions. Why Lyra? Why Epsilon Lyrae specifically? The ninth message gives astronomical coordinates, and those coordinates, when analyzed using modern positional astronomy, point to a specific region of the night sky in the Lyra constellation. This is not a vague general direction. It is a specific claim that can be checked against real astronomical data. Epsilon Lyrae is real. It is a well-known multiple star system, popular with amateur astronomers, because its components can be split with a small telescope on a night of good seeing. Its distance from Earth, approximately 162 light-years, is known with good precision from parallax measurements by the Hipparcos satellite and confirmed by the Gaia mission. Its composition, 4 stars in 2 gravitationally bound binary pairs, is well established. What is not known is whether it has planets. The Kepler mission surveyed a different region of the sky, and Epsilon Lyrae was not in its field of view. No dedicated planet search has been conducted for the Epsilon Lyrae system. This means the ninth message's claim about the origin point is not falsified by current astronomical data. It is also not confirmed. The claim is that a being capable of something like what Enki describes reaching Earth from 162 light-years away, participating in the creation of a biological design, encoding that design with enough durability to persist across 12,000 years of human history, originated from a planetary body in the Epsilon Lyrae system. This is an extraordinary claim. It requires interstellar travel at scales and with capabilities that exceed anything documented in human technological history. It requires a timeline for the development of that capability that, if the origin point is Epsilon Lyrae, would have had to predate humanity's current period of technology by at least thousands of years. None of this is impossible. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Life on Earth is approximately 3.8 billion years old. Complex animals have existed for approximately 600 million years. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for approximately 300,000 years. Recorded history spans approximately 5,000 years. Technological civilization capable of radio transmission, the threshold Carl Sagan used in his SETI calculations, has existed on Earth for approximately 150 years. Given the age of the universe and the distribution of potentially habitable planets across it, the probability that technological civilizations capable of interstellar travel have existed somewhere in the galaxy for millions of years before humanity developed is not zero. It is, by most estimates of cosmic probability, quite high. Enrico Fermi's famous question, "Where are they?" has prompted decades of debate in SETI circles. Proposed answers range from the Great Filter hypothesis, which suggests civilizations destroy themselves before reaching interstellar capability, to the Dark Forest hypothesis, which suggests advanced civilizations conceal themselves for strategic reasons, to the Zoo hypothesis, which suggests advanced civilizations are aware of Earth and have chosen not to make contact. None of these has been confirmed. But the answer, the ninth message's framework, implies that advanced beings from elsewhere have participated in humanity's biological and cultural development. Leaving encoded transmissions in the oldest writing system on Earth deserves at least as much serious examination as any of those proposals. The ninth message is not asking you to believe it without evidence. It is asking you to notice that the evidence it describes, the coordinates, the design, the encoded transmissions, the genetic signature, the 12 messages themselves, is present and available in the oldest written archive on Earth, in museums in London and Chicago and Philadelphia, cataloged and accessible and mostly set aside. Where are they? They left notes. The 10th message is about what that means for the people who carry the most complete form of the design across the long gap of the cycle. The 10th message is the first to use a term that does not have a clean Sumerian translation, and that most researchers have treated as a proper noun rather than a common word. The term is Sag-Kalos, which in its most literal rendering means the first great ones who continued, or the ancient ones who persisted. The 10th message describes these beings as what Enki calls the sleepers, entities that are not active, not absent, but in a state of what the text describes as deep waiting, Nirgal Ezu, the waiting of the deep waters. The 10th message says the sleepers are human. Specifically, they are humans of the lineage that carried the Mus-Hu-Shu in its most complete form. Individuals who, at specific moments in the history of the current cycle, entered states of what the text describes as Zipa Agku, deep breath holding, or suspended life, and have remained in those states across periods of time that exceed normal human lifespan. The 10th message places them in what Enki describes as the deep places, the same deep places that the 6th message's first condition refers to when it speaks of the hidden records being found in the deep earth and deep water. The claim is extraordinary, and it should be stated clearly as such. The 10th message appears to describe human beings in states of metabolic suspension that have persisted for thousands of years. This has no precedent in mainstream anthropology or biology. There are no known mechanisms by which a human organism could maintain biological viability across millennia of suspended animation. And yet the tradition of long-sleeping figures waiting to return appears across so many cultural frameworks that its persistence is itself worth examining. King Arthur, sleeping under the hill, waiting for Britain's hour of greatest need. Holger Danske, seated in the vault of Kronborg Castle, whose beard has grown through the stone table, waiting to rise when Denmark is in danger. Frederick Barbarossa, asleep in the Kyffhäuser mountain, whose beard has grown through the stone chair, waiting for Germany's time. The Mayan hero twins, who descend to the underworld and wait. The Hindu Vishnu, sleeping on the cosmic serpent Shesha, dreaming the universe into existence and waiting to incarnate when the Dharma requires it. The Egyptian Osiris, dismembered and waiting for reconstitution. The Buddhist Maitreya, the future Buddha, waiting in the Tushita heaven for the appropriate moment to descend. These traditions are not merely parallel mythological inventions. They are variations on a specific theme. A being of great power and knowledge, sleeping, preserving themselves across the gap between one age and the next, waiting to re-emerge when the conditions are appropriate. The 10th message identifies this theme as pointing towards something real, not metaphorical, not purely symbolic, but a reference to actual individuals in actual locations in states that the Sumerian texts describe with vocabulary that implies biological rather than spiritual suspension. The 10th message also contains a claim about the relationship between the sleepers and the time of the Great Remembering. Enki says, they cannot wake themselves. The awakening requires encounter with the design in its active form, the me calling to the me across the barrier of the suspended state. The sleepers wake. In this reading, when enough of the active carriers have integrated enough of the design that the collective field of the Mushushu becomes strong enough to reach the suspended ones in their deep places. Whether this is understood literally or metaphorically depends on the framework the reader brings. But the practical implication of the 10th message, taken at its most pragmatic, is this. The project of integrating the 12 messages and building the house of knowing is not only for the individual, it is a collective project with a collective threshold. The more individuals who carry the design through the process of integration, the closer the collective threshold is reached. The awakening of the sleepers is, in this reading, a consequence of the integration work being done right now, in this period, by people who have encountered these messages and recognized them. The 10th message closes with a line that has been quoted extensively by researchers who have worked with this sequence. They are waiting in the deep water and the deep earth, and what they are waiting for is enough of you to remember. What they are waiting for is enough of you to remember. The concept of the sleepers connects to one more layer of the 12-message architecture that has not yet been addressed directly. The question of what the sleepers are waiting to contribute that the active population cannot supply for itself. The 10th message is explicit about this. The sleepers carry direct memory, not transmitted knowledge, direct memory. The difference is the difference between reading about a war and having fought in one. Reading a history of the court of Ashurbanipal and having served in it, studying the cuneiform texts about the Anunnaki and having interacted with them directly. The sleepers, if the 10th message is accurate, have the latter form of knowledge. They remember what things were like before the barrier, before the flood, before the current cycle of suppressed knowing. They remember what the Anunnaki were actually like in person. They remember what the design felt like when it was new and integrated, rather than ancient and suppressed. This is knowledge that no amount of text study, archaeological recovery, or alternative history research can produce. It can only come from direct experience. And the 10th message's claim is that direct experiential memory of the pre-flood period exists not in documents, not in encoded mythologies, but in biological organisms that have been in a state of suspended waiting since before the flood erased the world they lived in. The implications of this are staggering if taken seriously. It would mean that when enough of the active carriers have integrated enough of the design, when enough people are in the condition the 11th message describes as Gam-A-C, the completed internal gathering, something happens. The field of the Mushushu in the active population becomes strong enough to reach the suspended ones. The sleepers begin to wake. And when they do, they add to the human knowledge base something that no living human currently possesses. The living memory of what Enki described. The lived experience of the design before it was suppressed. The knowledge of who the Anunnaki were, what they looked like, how they communicated, what they taught, what they were afraid of, what they hoped for. This is the final piece of the transmission that the 12 messages cannot contain within themselves. The messages can describe. The sleepers can remember. And the waking of the sleepers is the consequence, not a separate project, not a different goal of the same work that the messages are calling for. The integration work, the house building, the recognition of other carriers, the application of the 8th message's discernment framework, the building, first inside, then outside, for those who come after. When enough of you remember, the ones who never forgot will wake. The 11th message is the second to last, and it addresses the question that the sequence of the preceding 10 has been building toward, given everything that has been established the design. The barrier, the flood, the house, the bloodline, the countdown, the reset, the discernment framework, the origin point, the sleepers. What specifically are you being asked to do? The 11th message is housed as K13437 in the British Museum. Its physical condition is the most compromised. Of the 12 portions of the reverse face are damaged, and several passages require reconstruction from context, but its core content is legible, and its position as the penultimate message in the sequence makes its function clear. It is the operational instruction that precedes the closing transmission. The 11th message does not ask you to perform a ritual. It does not specify a practice in the way that a religious tradition specifies prayers, offerings, or observances. It does not promise specific outcomes in exchange for specific actions in the transactional framework. Of much of ancient religious literature do this, and the gods will do that in return. What it asks is at once more demanding and more open than any of those things. It asks you to integrate. The Sumerian term Enki uses, in the 11th message Gam-A-C, means literally to bring together into the self, or to make the internal gathering complete. It is the verb of synthesis, of the final construction phase of the house of knowing described in the 4th message. And what is to be integrated is everything the first 10 messages have established. The knowledge of what was placed in you, the understanding of the barrier, and its design dissolution, the encoded legacy of the flood, the structure of the inner house, the reality of the bloodline and its function, the timeline of the cycle, and the conditions of the Sag-Kizal, the discernment framework for the Nigina and the false, the origin point 16, 2 light years away, and its connection to your biology, and the reality of the sleepers waiting for enough of you to remember. Integration, in the 11th message's framing, is not intellectual synthesis. It is not building a coherent mental model that accounts for all these elements and can argue for their consistency. Intellectual synthesis of this material is a useful step, but it is not the destination. The destination is what the 11th message calls Gami-Sai, bringing all of it down from the level of concept into the level of lived experience, making the understanding of your design a felt reality rather than a position held about a text. This is precisely what the 4th message described as the 7th gate, the gate that opens not through effort or will, but through a quality of reception that the internal house makes possible when its construction is sufficiently complete. The 11th message describes 3 signs that the integration is genuinely occurring rather than being simulated by intellectual engagement. The first sign is what Enki calls the straightening of the back Namkiag, literally the beloved alignment. Not a physical posture, but a felt sense of internal organization, of the components of the design being in their proper relationship to each other. The dissonance and confusion that characterize the great shaking resolve, not because the external world becomes less complicated, but because the internal structure becomes more coherent. The back straightens. The framework stabilizes. The second sign is the quieting of Igigub, the standing eyes, the watching surface. In Sumerian iconography, the eye is the organ of vigilance, of scanning, of assessment. The Igigub is the mode of the surface mind that is perpetually oriented outward, scanning the external world for what it needs and what it needs to avoid. In modern neuroscience, this maps onto the activity of the prefrontal cortex in its executive vigilance function, the constant assessment and planning that characterizes waking consciousness at its most ordinary. When this quiets, not shuts down, but quiets, becomes less driving, the deep listening becomes possible. The antenna becomes functional. What was always receiving but was too obscured by the noise of the watching surface to be heard becomes audible. The third sign is the arrival of what Enki calls Numi AB, the not taught knowing. The information that comes without an external source. The understanding that arises from the interior rather than being imported from the outside. This is the direct knowing that the unauthorized me was designed to enable. And its arrival, when genuine, has a specific quality that distinguishes it from intellectual inference or intuitive guesswork. It has a certainty that is independent of the reasoning process, a self-evidence that does not require argument. The not taught knowing is not emotionally certain in the sense of feeling right, in the way things feel right when they fit our preferences or confirm our existing views. It is certain in the way that mathematics is certain the conclusion follows from the structure of the thing itself, not from how we feel about it. When these three signs occur together, the back straightening, the watching surface quieting, the not taught knowing arriving, the 11th message says the house of knowing is complete. The gate is open. What you receive through it is yours. No one put it there from outside. No institution gave it to you. No text transmitted it to you. It was in you before the first word of these 12 messages was spoken. It was in you before the temple told you what you were. It was in you before you were taught to forget. And then the 11th message gives its final instruction, the one that connects everything that has been built in the individual to the collective project that the 10th message describes. When the house is complete, do not keep it to yourself. This is the operational weight of everything the 5th message said about the bloodline as a carrying lineage. The design was not placed in you for your individual development. Your individual development is real and necessary. You cannot give what you have not integrated. But it is not the terminus. The design was placed in you because the knowledge it carries was meant to be given back to the full human population. The ones who carry the design in its active form and the ones who carry it in its latent form, the ones who have heard these messages and recognize them and the ones who have not yet had the opportunity. The ark carried its cargo not for the survivors alone. It carried it for all who would come after. The ones who carried the cargo were not its owners. They were its stewards. And the 11th message says, when your house is complete, you pass the cargo on. The 11th message's concept of Gami-C, the integration that completes the house of knowing, has a parallel in a tradition that is considerably more recent than the Sumerian tablets, but that the alternative history framework would identify as a downstream transmission of the same original knowledge, the Hermetic tradition. The Hermetic texts, compiled in late antiquity and attributed to the mythological figure Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, identified with the Egyptian Thoth and sometimes with the Greek Hermes, contain a cosmological and psychological framework that is strikingly consistent with the 12 messages. The Hermetica describe a creation event in which a divine being nous. The mind is attracted to the reflection of itself in the material world and descends into matter, becoming embodied and forgetting its divine origin in the process of embodiment. The goal of human life, in the Hermetic framework, is the reversal of this forgetting, the gradual recovery of the divine nature that was present at the origin but obscured by the descent into matter. The parallels with the 12 messages are structural. The unauthorized me is the Hermetic nous, the divine capacity embedded in the human design that the design's intended managers did not authorize. The barrier between the deep knowledge and the surface mind is the Hermetic veil of matter, the obscuration produced by the descent into embodiment. The Kiagazu, the self-recognizing fullness of the 6th message, is the Hermetic experience of anagnorisis, the recognition of one's divine nature, the moment of knowing that one is the nous that forgot itself. And the Gami-C of the 11th message, the completed internal gathering that produces direct knowing, is the Hermetic henosis, the union of the individual with the divine mind from which it descended. The Hermetic tradition did not originate in classical antiquity. The texts compiled in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD draw on much older Egyptian and Babylonian material. The Egyptian tradition explicitly connects the Hermetic framework to Thoth, the keeper of divine knowledge, the recorder of the cosmic design, the guardian of what was written in the beginning. Thoth in the Egyptian tradition has the same relationship to preserved knowledge that Enki has in the Sumerian. He is the figure who writes things down and makes sure they survive. The connection between Enki and Thoth has been noted by researchers in the comparative mythology tradition for decades. If the 12 messages are what the alternative history framework claims they are, the Hermetic tradition is one of the transmission pathways through which their core content entered the Western intellectual tradition, filtered, fragmented, and embedded in the philosophical vocabulary of late antique Alexandria, but carrying the structural fingerprint of the original design. The specific Hermetic text most relevant to the 11th message's instruction is the Corpus Hermeticum's first book, commonly known as the Poimandres, in which the narrator encounters Nous in the form of an enormous being of light and receives a vision of creation, fall, and return. The Poimandres describes the path of return, the soul's progressive passage upward through the planetary spheres, surrendering at each sphere the quality that sphere had imposed on the soul during the descent, and concludes with the union of the individual consciousness with the divine mind. 7 spheres. 7 qualities surrendered. 7 gates. The fourth message is 7 gates of the house of knowing. The Hermetic Poimandres is 7 planetary spheres. The Kabbalistic tree of life's 7 lower Sephiroth. The Hindu chakra system's 7 centers. These are convergent descriptions, in different cultural vocabularies, of the same developmental architecture. The 11th message does not require you to recognize these parallels to work, but recognizing them contextualizes what the GAM-AC instruction is pointing toward within the broader human knowledge tradition. You are not being asked to do something unprecedented or alien. You are being asked to do what the deepest and oldest layers of multiple human wisdom traditions have been pointing toward as the purpose of human development. The house of knowing, built first inside, is the Hermetic return. The 7th gate is the Hermetic kenosis. The GAM-EC is the Hermetic completion. And the instruction that follows when the house is complete, do not keep it to yourself, is the Hermetic teaching that the one who has returned does not leave the material world behind, but remains in it as a teacher, a carrier, a person through whom the divine mind operates with awareness rather than forgetting. You are not the destination. You are the delivery. You are not the destination. You are the delivery. The 12th message is the last word. The 12th message is housed as K13881 in the British Museum. It is not the longest of the 12. It is not the most analytically complex. It is not the most technically demanding. In some respects, it is the simplest, a closing address, a final transmission, a word from the one who speaks the truth, from the deep to whoever has arrived at the end. The 12th message begins without the Uda Namma Enki formula that opens the other 11. The formula, when the great fate of heaven and earth was being decided, established the temporal and cosmic frame for each of the preceding messages, grounding each one in the moment of the design's creation. The 12th message does not use this frame. It does not ground itself in the past. It opens with a direct present-tense address. I see you. In Sumerian, Mahanizu. Literally, I have seen the greatness in you. Not I observe you as a neutral object of attention. Not I acknowledge your existence. I see the greatness in you. The me I placed without authorization. The design that carried through the flood. The house you have been building through the reading of these messages. The gate that has been moving. The not taught knowing that is beginning to arrive. I see you. This is the disclosure that the entire 12-message sequence has been building toward. Not a cosmic secret about ancient history. Not a forbidden truth about suppressed archaeology, though those elements are real and present throughout the sequence. The final word of the being who made you, addressed to you directly across whatever distance of time and space separates you, is an act of recognition. I see what you are. I see what you carry. I see you in the completeness of what was designed and what survived and what you are in the act of becoming. I see you. The 12th message then gives what Enki calls the 3 final words. Not 3 sentences or 3 paragraphs, 3 Sumerian terms, each given with a brief explanatory phrase that form the closing transmission of the entire sequence. The first final word is An, Na, heaven, or the above, with the phrase from which you descend. You are not only earthly. The origin point of what was placed in you is 162 light-years away, in the direction of the constellation Lyra, in a system that ancient astronomers could observe, and that modern astronomers know as Epsilon Lyrae. The above from which you descend is not metaphorical. It is astronomical. The second final word is Ki, earth, or the below, with the phrase to which you were sent. You were not deposited here accidentally. You were sent. The word Enki uses in the 12th message for sent is not the passive word for being placed or arriving, but the active word for being commissioned, dispatched with a specific purpose, sent to a specific destination for a specific reason. You were sent to the earth. This world is your assignment. The third final word is Gal Great, or the fullness of a thing, or what a thing becomes when it achieves its designed completion, with the phrase, what you become when the two are joined. What you become when the above and the below are joined. When the Lyran origin and the earthly substance are fully integrated. When the unauthorized me and the human biology work together as designed. When the barrier dissolves and the deep knowledge integrates with the surface mind. When the house of knowing is complete and the 7th gate is open. Anna, Ki, Gal, heaven, earth, greatness. This is what was designed. This is what was preserved through the flood. This is what the bloodline carried. This is what the countdown counted toward. This is what the Sag Kizal enables. This is what the sleepers are waiting for enough of you to achieve so they can wake and add their direct memory to the growing field. The 12th message closes with a passage that most translators who have worked with it agree conveys, across all the difficulties of translating a language this old and this far removed from modern frameworks, something like this. The one who reads to the end was always going to read to the end. The one who carries what I placed will always have carried it. What was placed was always going to be found. I did not make you without purpose. I did not make you without knowing. I did not make you to forget forever. Remember what you carry. That is the last word of the 12th message. Remember, the 12th message's closing lines are brief, but the brevity is not simplicity. The three final words, and na, ki, gal, carry the entire argument of the preceding 11 messages in compressed form. They are, in the Sumerian tradition of the word as a functional thing, rather than a merely symbolic representation, a transmission in themselves, not a description of what the sequence has argued, a reminder of what you carry. And na, the above, the origin point, 1-6, 2 light years away, from which what was placed in you originated. The divine council's assembly, which did not authorize what Enki placed in you. The great cycle of the precession, whose turning marks the Sag Kizal. The cosmic design, which includes the earth and everything on it and everything above it in a structure of relationship that is neither random nor punitive, but ordered and developmental. And na is everything that comes from above, not in the sense of authority over you, but in the sense of origin and trajectory, where you come from, what the design in you is connected to. Ki, the below, the earth, specific and physical, the Tigris and Euphrates, the southern Mesopotamian plain where the first cities were built, the clay from which the first tablets were made, and from which, in the Sumerian account, the first humans were also made. The earthly substrate of the design, your body, your biology, the specific and physical reality of what you are as an organism on a particular planet in a particular star system, at a particular moment in cosmic time. Ki is not lesser than an A. In the Sumerian cosmological framework, the relationship between heaven and earth is not a hierarchy of better and worse. It is a union of complementary natures whose joining produces something that neither produces alone. Gal, the greatness. What you become when the two are joined. Not a metaphor for spiritual development or a theological promise of afterlife reward. A description, specific and functional, of what the design was always oriented toward. The integration of the Lyran origin with the earthly substrate, the activation of the unauthorized me, the completion of the internal house, the opening of the seventh gate, the arrival of the not taught knowing. Gal is not a future state to be earned. It is the name for what you are in the process of becoming, right now, in the course of encountering these 12 messages. And na, ki, gal. The three words are a summary, a reminder, and an activation. They do not require commentary. They require reception. The 12th message closes the sequence not as a conclusion closes an argument, but as a seal closes a transmission. The argument was made across 11 messages. The 12th does not continue the argument. It acknowledges the transmission is complete and identifies, in 3 words and 1 final instruction, what the transmission was always for. Remember, there is a version of what has been presented in this video that the mainstream academic community would recognize and accept in part. Scholars of Sumerian literature would confirm the existence of most of the tablets discussed here. They would confirm the catalog numbers, the museum holdings, the general content of the texts in the forms with which Assyriology is familiar. They would confirm that Enki is a figure of major importance in the Sumerian pantheon, that the Atrahasis epic describes a flood and that Enki plays a central role in warning the survivor, that the Sumerian king list records antediluvian reigns of remarkable length, that the cuneiform astronomical tradition was sophisticated far beyond what its surface material tools would seem to have enabled. They would accept the factual scaffolding. What they would reject is the interpretive framework, the identification of these tablets as a unified 12-message sequence, the reading of a first-person communication from Enki as being addressed to the future, the genealogical and genetic implications, the 9th message's claim of astronomical origin coordinates, and the argument that the entire sequence points toward a coherent alternative account of human origins that diverges fundamentally from the standard paleoanthropological narrative. The rejection is not arbitrary. There are genuine methodological problems with the alternative framework, and they should be stated clearly. Sitchin's translations have been criticized extensively by credentialed Assyriologists, including Michael Heiser, who argued in detailed published rebuttals that Sitchin's reading of specific Sumerian terms was both grammatically incorrect and culturally anachronistic. Heiser demonstrated that the word Anunnaki does not translate as those who came from heaven to earth, which is Sitchin's foundational linguistic claim, but rather as something like those of royal blood or great princes, or in other readings, those who from heaven were assigned. The two translations have very different implications. Heiser also demonstrated that Nibiru, the planet Sitchin, identifies as the Anunnaki homeworld, refers in the cuneiform astronomical texts not to a 12th planet on a long elliptical orbit, but to a specific celestial body associated with the crossing point, probably Jupiter, or in some contexts Mercury, moving through the ecliptic. These criticisms are substantive and affect the specific architecture of Sitchin's argument significantly. The identification of the 12 tablets as a deliberate sequence requires a framework that the tablets themselves do not announce. The opening formula, Uda na ma Ankie, is not unique to these 12 texts. It appears in other Sumerian literature. The first-person Enki voice appears in many cuneiform texts without belonging to the sequence. The framework has to be brought to the tablets. It cannot be extracted from them through neutral philological analysis. This is an epistemological problem that any serious engagement with the alternative framework has to acknowledge. And the genetic and astronomical claims, while consistent with the framework at the level of general direction, are not independently supported by those fields in ways that would satisfy the evidentiary standards of genetics or astronomy. No peer-reviewed paper in either field has connected its findings to the 12-message framework. The connections drawn in the alternative history literature between, say, the genomic bottleneck data and Enki's claim about the flood as a selective event remain interpretive rather than demonstrative. These are legitimate criticisms. They should not be minimized or evaded. But the suppression of the alternative account of human origins deserves examination beyond the legitimate methodological objections, because there is something in the pattern of institutional response that goes beyond ordinary academic skepticism. The history of the suppression of anomalous knowledge is long, and it is worth examining more carefully than the summary above provides. Because the pattern of suppression and the pattern of survival despite the suppression is itself significant. Consider the history of what happened to the Sumerian texts after their recovery. When George Smith published his discovery of the Babylonian flood narrative in 1872, the immediate institutional response was not to treat it as confirmation of a shared ancient memory of catastrophe, but to treat it as a source text problem for the Hebrew Bible. The question that the Academy asked was, who copied from whom? Did the Hebrews borrow from the Babylonians? Did the Babylonians have an older Semitic source? The question of whether the flood narrative preserved a real memory of a real event was largely set aside in favor of the literary and theological question of textual dependence. This is a characteristic pattern in the institutional response to anomalous ancient evidence. The anomaly is acknowledged, then immediately contextualized within a framework that contains and neutralizes its most challenging implications. The Sumerian flood narrative is anomalous because it predates the Genesis account by centuries. But instead of asking what both accounts might be preserving in imperfect form, the institutional response asks the smaller and more manageable question of which text is derived from which. The implication that both might be imperfect records of a real event is not examined. The same pattern appears in the treatment of Göbekli Tepe. The site in southeastern Turkey was discovered by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in 1994. Its construction has been dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, at the very end of the Younger Dryas period, as the last ice age was terminating. It consists of massive stone pillars, carved with detailed animal reliefs and abstract symbols, arranged in circles up to 30 meters in diameter. The individual stones weigh between 10 and 20 tons. They were quarried from limestone outcroppings several hundred meters away and moved into position with no evidence of the metal tools, draft animals, or wheeled vehicles that the standard model of human technological development says would not exist for another several thousand years. Göbekli Tepe has been acknowledged by mainstream archaeology as a genuine paradigm challenge. Klaus Schmidt himself said it would require a revision of the standard account of the emergence of civilization, and yet the revision has been slow and limited. The standard response is to treat Göbekli Tepe as an isolated anomaly, extraordinary, remarkable, but not evidence of a broader pre-agricultural civilization. The possibility that Göbekli Tepe is one surviving surface feature of a civilizational landscape that the Younger Dryas flood largely erased the possibility that it is a monument built in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe by survivors of a more advanced culture. Encoding in stone the knowledge they were trying to preserve this possibility is not seriously engaged with in the mainstream literature. The suppression, as noted earlier, is not usually a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of paradigm protection in an established field. Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, described how scientific paradigms resist anomalous evidence, not because scientists are corrupt or dishonest, but because the framework within which scientists operate determines what counts as evidence, what questions are worth asking, and what kinds of answers are acceptable. An anomaly that cannot be absorbed into the existing framework is not usually the thing that changes the framework. It is usually set aside, filed as interesting but unexplained, and the work of the field continues in the direction the framework supports. The accumulation of anomalies changes the framework, not any single anomaly. The accumulation. And the anomalies relevant to the standard account of human prehistory have been accumulating for more than a century across multiple disciplines at an accelerating rate. George Smith, who first identified the Babylonian flood narrative in the Kuyunjik collection in 1872, was treated with the combination of professional caution and delayed validation that characterizes the response to paradigm-challenging discoveries in any established field. He was not credentialed. His methodology was idiosyncratic. His discovery required the field to acknowledge that the Genesis flood story had a Mesopotamian precursor that predated it by centuries, which had significant theological implications that the academic world of the 1870s was not eager to absorb. Validation came, but it came slowly, and only because the evidence was impossible to ignore. The pattern repeats across the anomalous evidence that accumulates around the standard model of human prehistory. The geological evidence for massive flooding events at the Younger Dryas termination was known to geologists decades before J. Harlan Bretz proposed his glacial outburst hypothesis in the 1920s, but the hypothesis was rejected by the mainstream geological community for 40 years before the physical evidence became impossible to explain in any other way. The evidence for sophisticated pre-agricultural civilizations at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was built approximately 11,600 years ago by people who, according to the standard model, should have been living in small hunter-gatherer bands, with no capacity for organized monumental construction, continues to accumulate without producing the paradigm revision that would seem to follow from it. The anthropologist Wade Davis has written about what he calls the ethnosphere, the sum total of all human culture's knowledge systems, mapped onto the surface of a single sphere. The ethnosphere is being lost at a rate comparable to the loss of the biosphere. Languages dying, knowledge systems disappearing, traditions that encoded specific understandings of the world dissolving into the global monoculture. The 12 messages, in the alternative history framework, are an attempt from within that monoculture's source material to recover something from the ethnosphere that the monoculture itself cannot produce or replace. The knowledge was encoded in the oldest writing system. It was preserved in the world's first and greatest library. It survived the burning of that library by accident or design. It was shipped to London, catalogued, filed, and largely set aside. And it is being encountered now, in this moment, by people who would not exist as they are without the monoculture, but who carry in their biology something that the monoculture did not put there. This is the tension at the heart of the Alternative History Project. The framework for recovering the knowledge is itself produced by the civilization that suppressed it. The tools of interpretation, comparative linguistics, archaeoastronomy, population genetics, the analysis of ancient texts, are methodologies developed within the modern scientific tradition. The 12 messages cannot be read at all without the work of Assyriology. The genetic bottleneck evidence cannot be presented without modern genomics. The astronomical analysis of the 9th message's coordinates requires modern astronomical software. The recovery of what was suppressed requires the use of the very systems within which the suppression operated. This is not a contradiction. It is actually consistent with what the 12th message says about what the time of the Great Remembering looks like. The descendants of the Anunnaki and the descendants of the Lulu searching the sky together. The tools of the modern scientific tradition are the descendants of the Anunnaki's tradition, the astronomy, the mathematics, the systematic observation and record-keeping, and the 12 messages are the descendants of the Lulu's design. They come together in this search. The suppression, in the end, was not total. Whatever removed the tablets from active knowledge did not destroy them. Whatever classified them as hymnic literature or astronomical fragments rather than as a unified communication did not make them unreadable. Whatever institutional and cultural inertia has delayed their serious examination as a sequence did not prevent the sequence from existing. And whatever in the contemporary cultural moment produces the specific kind of attention that is drawn to this material. The growing body of people who find themselves inexplicably interested in questions about ancient history, human origins, forbidden knowledge, and the nature of the design that was placed in humanity Whatever produces that attention, it is producing it now, at the exact moment the seventh condition of the sixth message describes as the time of the great remembering. The suppression was designed to fail, not immediately, not before the appropriate phase of the cycle, but at the Sag Kizal, which, by the sixth message's 7 conditions, is now. Before that question is addressed, it is worth pausing on what the 12 messages represent structurally, not just in content, but in form, because the form is itself significant. The 12 messages were inscribed on clay tablets. Clay tablets are extraordinarily durable. The Sumerian writing tradition used clay precisely because clay, when baked, survives virtually everything that human history can produce. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh survived the burning of the city in 612 BC, not despite being a library, but because it was a clay tablet library. The fire that destroyed the palace baked the tablets harder than they had ever been, preserving them across the 2.5 millennia that separated their creation from their rediscovery. Paper burns, papyrus crumbles, parchment rots. Clay tablets, once baked, survive. This means the choice of medium for the 12 messages was a choice about longevity. Writing on clay is not the most efficient form of inscription. It is labor-intensive. The tablets are heavy and fragile before baking. The cuneiform writing system requires significant training to produce and to read. It is, however, the most durable option available to someone living in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago who wanted to ensure their words would survive for a very long time. The 12 messages were written with the expectation that they would need to survive an extremely long time, not decades, not centuries. The third message describes the kin, the double measure, the ratio of 432,000 inches terms that suggest a timeline of thousands of years between the writing of the messages and the moment when they would be read. Whoever wrote them expected the gap to be enormous. They chose the medium accordingly. They chose clay. There is a further layer to the medium that connects to the content. The Sumerian account of the creation of humanity involves clay. The Lulu was made from clay and the blood of a divine being. The first humans were clay tablets, in a metaphorical sense inscribed with the design that Enki placed in them. And the 12 messages, which describe that inscription and call for its integration, were themselves inscribed in clay. The medium and the message are the same thing. The clay that carries the words is made of the same substance as the beings the words are addressed to. In the Sumerian worldview, this is not a coincidence or a poetic accident. It is a functional correspondence. The words inscribed in clay and the design inscribed in clay-made beings are the same kind of thing at different scales. The message in the clay activates the design in the beings made from clay. This is what the second message describes when it talks about the ki sikya lil la, the resonant essence that activates when it encounters specific kinds of truth. The clay of the tablets and the clay of the bodies resonate at the same frequency. The messages were written in the medium that would speak directly to the beings they were addressed to. This is not mysticism, or rather, it is the kind of mysticism that has a physical correlate. Resonance is a real phenomenon. The capacity of one vibrating system to activate another system of similar natural frequency is documented physics. Whether there is a literal resonance between the chemical composition of baked Mesopotamian clay and the biological composition of human organisms is not something that has been studied. Whether there is a structural resonance, a correspondence of pattern between the encoding medium and the encoded being, is a philosophical question that the Sumerian framework would answer yes to, and that the 12 messages appear to be acting on. The messages were written in clay for the clay beings to read. They survived in clay long enough for the clay beings to find them. And they are being read now, in this form, by beings who are still, despite 5,000 years of cultural development, despite everything that has changed, made substantially from the same earth that the first tablets were inscribed on. The medium is the message. The clay carries what the clay was made to carry. And the resonance, if the second message's framework is correct, is already operating in you, in the act of reading or hearing these words, whether or not you experience it consciously in this moment. There is one final question that requires attention before this video concludes, and it is the most important one. What do you actually do with this? The 12 messages, taken together, are not purely informational. They are not a story to be heard and then set aside. They are not an alternative history to be compared with other alternative histories and evaluated for relative plausibility. They are, if the framework holds at all, a design activation sequence. Each message does something to the reader who engages with it seriously. The first plants the question. The second describes the mechanism. The third encodes the timeline. The fourth gives the construction principle. The fifth activates the recognition of what is being carried. The sixth names the moment. The seventh prepares for the transition. The eighth gives the discernment tool. The ninth establishes the origin. The 10th describes the broader project. The 11th instructs the integration. The 12th closes the transmission with recognition, and the three final words. Something is activated by reading this in sequence. Whether that something is the me opening the gate, or the beginning of a new way of thinking about human origins, or simply the unfamiliar feeling of a coherent framework for anomalous evidence you have encountered before. Without a framework for it, something happens. Something is different at the end of the sequence than it was at the beginning. The 11th message says, when the house is complete, do not keep it to yourself. The practical implementation of that instruction in the contemporary world looks different from what it would have looked like in any previous period. The second condition of the sixth message, the children of the design, finding each other across distances impossible to cross with feet, is the mechanism by which the not keeping to yourself happens in the time of the great remembering. You share what you received. You engage seriously with the questions rather than treating them as entertainment. You bring the discernment framework of the eighth message to your existing frameworks, religious, scientific, cultural, personal, and you ask, with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness, what each of them moves toward and what each of them moves away from. You sit with what the fifth message describes as the recognition, the felt sense of remembering rather than learning, and you do not dismiss it because the culture you live in does not have a category for it. You build the house of knowing, according to the fourth message's specifications. First inside, because what you build inside will show you what to build outside, and what you build outside will teach the ones who come after what to build inside. You recognize the other carriers when you encounter them, across whatever distances, with whatever tools the current period provides for that recognition. And you hold the discernment of the eighth message, the Niggina, the genuine as the measure of every framework you encounter, including this one. Because the eighth message says, even what I am telling you now should be measured by whether it increases your capacity or decreases it, whether it moves you toward the open gate or away from it, whether it traces back to the design or away from it. Measure this video by that measure. Measure this video by that measure. And if, after applying that measure, you find that something in what has been presented here moves in the direction of the open gate rather than the closed one, that something in the sequence of these 12 messages increases something in you rather than diminishing it, then the eighth message's tool has done its work. You have exercised the discernment Enki designed you to exercise. You have not believed because an authority told you to believe. You have tested by the Niggina, the genuine, and found what you found. That exercise itself, the act of applying an internal standard of evaluation rather than deferring to an external institutional authority, is the unauthorized me in operation. It is the direct knowing beginning to function as designed. It is the gate moving, if only slightly, if only for a moment, in the direction of open. And if what you find, applying that measure, is that something here does not feel genuine, that something here moves away from the open gate rather than toward it, then apply the same test with the same seriousness and arrive where your own evaluation leads you. The eighth message does not ask you to believe Enki. It asks you to measure by the Niggina, the genuine. The measurement is your responsibility. Its result is your own. Enki said, I made you to remember, and you were taught to forget. The human civilization that produced the Sumerian texts is, by any measure, extraordinarily ancient. It predates the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. It predates the oldest Greek philosophical texts by over 2,000 years. It predates the Common Era by well over 3,000 years. The tablets on which the 12 messages are inscribed were fired in kilns that no longer exist by scribes whose names were not recorded, in a city that is now a mound of dirt, in a country that has been continuously disrupted by conflict for the better part of a century. The knowledge system they were part of was largely lost, then partially recovered, and is still being translated and interpreted and debated by a small community of specialists whose work most of the world does not know exists. And yet the messages survived. 12 messages. 5,000 years of clay and fire and migration and loss and recovery. The largest library the ancient world ever produced. The burning of Nineveh. The crates in the British Museum. The decades of unread tablets. The slow work of translation. The contested interpretations. The alternative researchers working outside the academy and the mainstream scholars working within it, none of them seeing quite the same thing in the same tablets, all of them contributing to the slowly assembling picture of what was preserved and what was said. And then this moment, this video. You, wherever you are, at the end of 12 messages, read in order from first to last. The countdown in the sixth message was not counting toward a disaster. It was counting toward this. Toward enough of the design being active in enough carriers that the messages could circulate and be recognized and begin to do what they were written to do. The one who reads to the end was always going to read to the end. The one who carries what was placed always carried it. What was placed was always going to be found. In the time of the great remembering, by those who were built to find it. An-na, ki, gal, heaven, earth, greatness. What you become when the two are joined. Remember,